Every war crime explained. There's an old saying that goes, all is fair in love and war. But I would argue that saying is totally and utterly wrong. And unless you would consider breaking up a happy family to get the girl of your dreams, or killing innocent civilians to satisfy your political means as fair, then I would imagine you would agree. And in that case, I think the fact that there is literally things that are legal and illegal in war bolsters my theory. And also brings us to the point of today's video. War undoubtedly is one of the most hellish experiences available on Earth. And somewhat paradoxically, war has its own code of ethics. Now, whether or not these codes are actually followed or not depends. Regardless, there are some acts, weapons, and strategies that are considered simply too cruel for war. And in today's video, I'm going to describe in detail every single thing that is banned or illegal in war, starting with the earliest recorded examples of war crimes and ending in the current standards for ethical warfare, aka everything that is considered a war crime. Let's begin. Ancient rules of war. With how brutal day-to-day life was thousands of years ago, it's almost hard to imagine how brutal war must have been in that time period. However, believe it or not, even in some of the earliest civilizations, the concept of ethical war and war crimes was present, albeit in a rather rudimentary way. Now, it's important to note that the term war crime has really only existed since the 1800s, although the concept of rules in warfare predates that by thousands of years, and actually has set the foundation for modern war crimes and war standards today. I'm going to keep this section brief, although I did want to quickly mention a few interesting and unique war crimes from a handful of different ancient civilizations. Starting in ancient India, going back all the way to roughly 600 BCE, ancient Indian texts proved that there was a code of conduct when it came to warfare, and this code of conduct was known as the Dharma Yuddha, essentially translating to righteous warfare. The principles of the Dharma Yuddha were meant to be taken as law, and it was said that breaking these rules during warfare would result in moral consequences. And the rules stated in the Dharma Yuddha are the following. Firstly, equal fights only. And what this meant was that chariots were only meant to attack chariots, and one soldier could only attack one soldier. If there was a battle taking place, the battle was meant to be fair. Secondly, no attacking sleeping, retreating, or surrendering soldiers. And on top of this, you may also not harm unarmed women, children, elderly people, or disabled people. The third law of the Dharma Yuddha states that combat begins after sunrise and ends after sunset. And the fourth law states that there may be no poisoned, barbed, or hidden weapons used in warfare. And finally, surrendered enemy soldiers must be protected and treated as prisoners of war. And wounded enemies who surrender to you must be treated and cared for. During 5th century BCE in ancient China, they too had their own code of conduct when it came to warfare, with some of the most notable examples being the following. Firstly, no attacking unready enemies. This would essentially eliminate sneak attacks or ambushes. Secondly, you were not to take advantage of fleeting or surrendering enemies in distress, meaning that if there is an enemy that is retreating or simply unoffensively tending to his own wounds, you may not take advantage of that situation, and ideally you would offer them help if they are truly surrendering. Interestingly, it was also around this time when Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, was released. And in it, he emphasized the importance of strategy over brutality in warfare, and suggested focusing on subduing power players to avoid excessive destruction in cities. Now, while this may seem noble and ahead of its time, it's important to note that this wasn't a humanitarian play. This was simply an example of high-leverage strategies to be used ideally in war. This doesn't mean that they would be against brutality if strategy didn't work. The teachings just advised trying to use strategy when possible. And finally, during the 8th century BCE in ancient Greece, there was a set of customary rules known as the common laws of the Hellenes when it came to warfare. And these laws were the following. If you are to partake in war, an official declaration is required. If a war is ongoing, you still must respect sacred truces. And one example of this would be the Olympic Games. Thirdly, if you were in possession of dead enemies, you had to return them if requested. And finally, you may not mutilate enemy corpses, as it was considered barbaric. Now, a couple of notes about these Greek rules specifically. For starters, these were not necessarily written, followed rules. These were actually unwritten customs that were, well, customary and agreed upon across different Greek city-states. And it's important to note that these rules specifically applied to inter-Greek conflicts, with the sole goal of limiting brutality when it comes to Greek-on-Greek violence and warfare. With that being said, that means that these rules did not apply to non-Greek barbarians. Meaning that if you were a Greek soldier fighting a non-Greek soldier, all of these rules were out of the window. And even if you were a Greek soldier fighting a different Greek soldier, because enforcement was so weak on these rules, and this was more or less of a gentleman's agreement, having these rules be followed was, well, on a case-by-case basis, to say the least. But now that we are armed with ancient historical context when it comes to rules of war and war crimes, I want to jump directly to the establishment of the modern war crime to describe exactly how war crimes came to be in the first place and how the term war crime evolved from its establishment in the roughly 1800s to the modern day, the Lieber Code. As we've discussed so far in this video, throughout history, there have been countless cultures with countless different customs or rules or gentlemen's agreements when it comes to warfare. But it wasn't until 1863, with the establishment of the Lieber Code, that there was ever one formalized, codified system that sought to govern and be the official law when it came to war. Francis Lieber was born in 1798 in Berlin, and as a young adult, Francis was exposed to the horrors of war. He first fought for Prussia in the Napoleonic Wars, and then later fought in the Greek War of Independence less than a decade later. Fortunately, Francis survived both of these wars, and ended up moving to America and became an academic. He worked in the University of South Carolina as a tenured professor for both history and political economy. And it was actually at this job where he met Major General Henry W. Halleck. And shortly after becoming professionally acquainted, Francis was commissioned by this Major General to write the first instructions for the government of the armies of the United States in the field, aka the General's Orders 100, aka the Lieber Code. And the initial purpose of the Lieber Code was to be the military law that governed the actions of the Union Army during the Civil War. Now, this was no small task. Francis Lieber was literally just asked to make the rules of war for an entire army based off of basically all of the customs of war to ever exist. And while this job may seem daunting, he was the perfect man for the job, as he had both war experience, law experience, and political experience. And what he presented to the American government at the time not only went on to shape the Civil War, but also served as the basis for other warfare-related laws that came later down the line. One notable example being the Geneva Convention, which we're going to discuss soon. Now, with that being said, let's dive into exactly what the Lieber Code suggests should and shouldn't be allowed in war. Now, it's important to note that the Lieber Code literally has 157 articles, which is why I'm going to discuss the main points specifically pertaining to war crimes, or what should not be allowed in war. According to the Lieber Code, the following acts are either admissible under military necessity or outright forbidden in any context, and they go as follows. Firstly, and kind of ironically, the first thing that is prohibited is cruelty, which to me sounds like a complete oxymoron, saying that cruelty is banned in war. But in the context of the Lieber Code, it is suggested that the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering or revenge is unnecessary. And how this could look on the battlefield is if your goal is to kill your enemy, you may do so effectively and quickly. However, if you are intentionally doing it in a slow or cruel way, potentially injuring non-vital limbs, that could be considered intentional cruelty and be punishable by death according to the Lieber Code. There's quite a few things that are considered war crimes under the Lieber Code, so for the rest of these, I'm going to kind of go rapid fire. Other notable acts that are considered war crimes under the Lieber Code are as follows. Torturing enemy soldiers, including to extort them for confessions. Using poison in any way. Any act of hostility that makes returning to peace unnecessarily difficult. Destruction of property that is not commanded by an authorized officer. Robbery, specifically stealing private items off of enemy soldiers. Rape of any kind. Wounding, maiming, or killing civilians. Committing any crime against civilians, including arson, murder, robbery, fraud, or forgery. Killing prisoners of war, racially discriminating prisoners of war, and firing upon outposts, sentinels, or pickets. Now, even with that small bit of context, it's easy to understand that the core purpose of the Lieber Code was to minimize cruelty and prolonged suffering as much as possible within the context of war. And with the Lieber Code literally being the first draft ever made in the context of war crimes and international humanitarian law, it's truly not a bad first draft, especially for being made by one guy. And the Lieber Code was thought to be so fair and so revolutionary at the time that on April 24th, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln himself issued the Lieber Code to be the official binding military law for the Union Army throughout the American Civil War. And while the Lieber Code initially had a very niche application, at least in a global context, it would soon go on to become the global standard when it comes to humanitarian law during warfare, as well as the global governing law when it comes to war crimes. But with that being said, the Lieber Code was the first ever formal recognition and establishment of what war crimes were and consisted of, although these rules only applied to one army for one war, and did not become federal or international law until later. Which brings us to our next section, the Hague Conventions. Following the end of the American Civil War, the concept of federal or potentially even international laws regarding war became a popular thought experiment among political figures, military strategists, and academics alike. And it was for this reason that the Hague Conventions were established. The Hague Conventions were a series of international treaties and declarations negotiated in both 1988 and 1907 at two different peace conferences in the Netherlands. And the Hague Conventions were the precursor to the famous Geneva Conventions, which we'll get into next. But the Hague Conventions are extremely important in the context of war crimes because just like the Lieber Code was the first ever recognized law for warfare, the Hague Conventions was the first ever international law when it came to war crimes, and laws of war. And as I stated earlier, the Lieber Code was a massive influence on the Hague Conventions, although the two are not identical, with the Hague Conventions affirming the Lieber Code but also adding the following. And just for context, I'm going to be combining both Hague Conventions into one, because the 1899 and the 1907 Hague Conventions are both similar. The 1907 Hague Conventions were just a revision of the original. So for that reason, I'm just going to combine them here. With that being said, notable new war crimes include killing or wounding an enemy who has laid down his arms or no longer has a means of defense, improperly using national flags, military insignias, or military uniforms, using bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body, attacking or bombarding towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings that are undefended, looting towns that are occupied, declaring no mercy or refusing surrender, forcing civilians in occupied territories to give up information about their country's army or its means of defense, collective punishments for acts of individuals, general destruction or pillaging of private property unless demanded by military necessity, attacking hospital ships or medical personnel, not respecting neutral powers and territories, and automatic submarine contact mines must not become indiscriminate hazards after control is lost. Which I have no idea how you would even go about, well, collecting mines in an area you've already lost. Like, if the mines are there and then you've lost control of the area or the mine itself, I don't know how you're going to make it indiscriminate. If a contact mine comes in contact, it's going off. But regardless, the Hague Conventions were groundbreaking when it came to international humanitarian and warfare law, and also made some interesting changes when it came to warfare in general, like the addition of laws pertaining to naval warfare. But of course, the establishment of war crimes did not end with the Hague Conventions, which leads us to our next and likely most famous conventions, the Geneva Conventions. Here we are. That's right, which you've all been waiting for. The most famous and also most recent adaptation of the list of actions that are considered war crimes, as well as other codes of conduct when it comes to warfare and humanitarian stuff. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 are the most famous Geneva Conventions and consist of 4 different treaties. These 4 treaties consist of previous Geneva Conventions. Interestingly, the Geneva Conventions actually date back to the 1860s, predating the Hague Conventions, but that initial Geneva Convention really only focused on one thing, and I figured I would put all of the Geneva Conventions together and chronologically time it with the 1949 Geneva Conventions because that's where it really became its final form, so to speak. If you're unfamiliar, the Geneva Convention itself is the core of all modern international humanitarian law, or IHL, and its sole goal is to protect the victims of armed conflicts. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 were of course a byproduct of the end of the Second World War, where many crimes against humanity and war crimes were committed. And on top of the Geneva Conventions in 1949, we also saw the establishment of the Nuremberg Principles, which isn't worth its own section, but essentially the Nuremberg Principles were created not necessarily to define war crimes, but to ensure war crimes were punished. And because there was a lot of Nazi Party members after World War II who committed war crimes, the International Law Commission and United Nations saw it was vital that they created the Nuremberg Principles to ensure all of these guilty individuals did not escape punishment. To put it briefly, the Nuremberg Principles basically state that anybody who commits a war crime is, well, a war criminal. And most importantly, anybody who commits a war crime is subject to penalty at an international level with international law. And internal laws of a country cannot impede or override this international law. Essentially meaning that if you were a Nazi general who committed a war crime, the German government could not change their local laws to get you off of the hook for this war crime, because the war crime or international law supersedes the national law. And on top of this, the Nuremberg Principles also ensured that political status did not relieve the war criminal of their punishment, which is important. But yeah, that's basically the Nuremberg Principles, just ensuring that the laws were actually taken seriously and enforced. But back to the Geneva Conventions. The first Geneva Convention was actually introduced, like I mentioned, in 1864, and was specifically aimed at creating rules around the treatment of sick and wounded armed forces on the battlefield. The Second Geneva Convention actually replaced the Hague Convention of 1907 and essentially contained everything from the First Geneva Convention and the Hague Conventions. The Third Geneva Convention was focused on the treatment of war prisoners and replaced the previous Geneva Convention, and the fourth and final Geneva Convention is the one we're discussing now, which is basically the all-encompassing Geneva Convention. Now, with all of this being said, before I say Geneva Convention for the millionth time, let me explain some of the newest additions introduced with the Geneva Conventions. Once again, this list includes introductions from all of the Geneva Conventions, dating from the 1860s to the 1940s. The Geneva Gas Protocol states that the use of any asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases and biological warfare methods are strictly prohibited and considered war crimes. Torture, inhumane treatments, including biological experiments, are also war crimes. Compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person, like civilians, to serve in the forces of a hostile power is a war crime. Depriving a prisoner of war or enemy civilian of their rights and a regular trial is a war crime. And instead of just repeating myself and saying everything's a war crime, everything I'm about to say is a war crime. Taking of hostages, unlawful deportation or unlawful confinement, any act that outrages personal dignity, specifically humiliating or degrading treatment of a protected person, any type of violence, murder, or mutilation of a protected person. You must search for, collect, care for, and evacuate without discrimination when it comes to prisoners of war. You must not attack medical transports or facilities. You must not deprive prisoners of war of food, clothing, medical care, and they must not do forced labor in dangerous or hostile conditions. You must protect one's family's honor and religious practices, and you must not make any indiscriminate attacks. In addition to these, you cannot use human shields, you cannot attack cultural objects or monuments, you cannot intentionally starve civilians as a method of warfare, and you cannot attack undefended or demilitarized zones. And this, of course, is also in addition to all of the other previous laws and rules I suggested. That is, after the ancient ones. The ancient ones don't apply here. But yeah, once again, I'm sure you can see another common theme amongst all of these codes and conventions. The underlying thesis is that these rules are supposed to prohibit unnecessary suffering across the board and specifically protect non-participants in the war, aka sick, elderly, injured, or civilians. And one of the biggest changes with the Nuremberg trials and the Geneva Conventions is the mandate for accountability of people who break these war crimes. But yeah, if you were like me and were shocked when you learned that there was rules to war and, well, a lot of them, you were probably also super shocked when you learned that, according to Geneva Conventions, if you come across enemy soldiers that are surrendering to you or injured, you have to essentially take care of them and treat them as one of your own, which is something I did not know at all. And while I'm curious how much this is actually, well, honored, it is nice to see that there is at least rules in place to take care of your fellow human, even in some of the most hellish and disgusting conditions ever imaginable. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. If you were to ask what constitutes a war crime, the informed answer would be, that depends, specifically on the culture and the time period. But now that I just said that out loud, I feel like that's kind of a Redditor answer to that question. So let me give you the once and for all conclusive list of major war crimes that exist in the modern day. Willful killing of protected persons, torture or inhumane treatment, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to protected persons, forcing protected persons to fight against their own side, depriving rights to free trial, unlawful deportation or confinement, taking hostages, directly attacking civilians, indiscriminate attacks, using human shields, using starvation as a method of war, any sort of sexual violence, using soldiers under the age of 15, using banned weapons like poison gas, conducting treacherous acts such as pretending to surrender only to ambush an enemy, declaring no mercy and refusing surrender, pillaging or looting, humiliating or degrading treatment of a protected person, including mutilation, environmental warfare, and attacks on peacekeeping or humanitarian missions. And in case you forgot, protected persons basically include civilians, wounded enemies, or prisoners of war, as well as neutral parties and peacekeepers, and others that I'm sure I'm forgetting. But interestingly enough, after looking at different cultures, different eras, and different contexts, it's interesting to see how nearly every treaty or rule or custom we discussed all had the same goal of eliminating unnecessary suffering when possible, almost to assume that war may be inevitable. However, while suffering may be a byproduct, it's a variable that can be minimized and should be if possible, which is kind of a morbid silver lining in this entire situation.
The craziest things ever seen in space. The Oh My God particle. It is October 15th, 1991, and you and your best scientist bro are hanging out at the Fly's Eye Observatory in Utah. You're doing what you do every evening. You're looking into space for ultra-high energy cosmic rays, trying to find something cool and learn more about the universe. This night was like any other night, if not quieter. There was no new discoveries and nothing to even observe whatsoever. And while you and your scientist buddy were just throwing back scientific beers, you notice a light blinking on your desk. And it's a signal that the Fly's Eye Observatory is picking up something strong. And because this is the most action you've had all night, you decide to take a look at the data. And what you see on the chart blows your mind. As your scientific jaw drops to the scientific floor, all your scientific buddy could say is, "What do you see?" And while thoughts and ideas were bouncing around your mind at 1,000,000 miles per hour, the only words you could utter were, "Oh my God." Later leading to the name of this now iconic particle.
The oh my god particle, which has no relation to the God particle, which came later, was an ultra-high energy cosmic ray that was obviously detected by the Fly's Eye Observatory in Utah in 1991. And at the time, the oh my god particle was the highest energy cosmic ray ever to be observed. And as of today, in 2026, that record has still yet to be broken, making this particle very fitting of its name. Now, interestingly and somewhat unsurprisingly, this experimental observatory that was built on a military base in Utah was actually specifically built for this one purpose. The so-called high-resolution Fly's Eye detector was literally meant to only capture ultra-high energy cosmic rays. And that, it definitely did. You see, the reason why the oh my god particle is so significant and the reason why it was so shocking to the scientists who first observed it is because it wasn't only just an anomaly or something that was rare. The energy and speed in which the oh my god particle possessed was thought to be scientifically impossible prior to its discovery. And even after its observation, it was highly questioned and thoroughly ensured that this wasn't just a miscalculation. For a bit more context, we don't quite know what type of particle the oh my god particle was, although we can assume that it was a proton due to the fact that nearly 70% of high energy cosmic rays are protons. However, fortunately, what we do know is the sheer insane power that this mysterious particle possessed. For starters, the collision energy of the oh my god particle was 40 million times more powerful than the highest energy protons ever produced in the world's strongest particle accelerator. That's right. This one random particle was literally 40 million times stronger than the strongest particle that we intentionally accelerated on Earth. And while that obviously is impressive, it's also a bit deceiving. Because although it technically had 40 million times more energy, not all of that energy was available. And the definition of availability in the context of particle collision essentially means the amount of energy that is actually able to create new particles in the event of a collision. And it's been calculated that in the event of an actual particle collision, the oh my god particle would have had roughly 200 times more energy than the most energetic particle in the world's best particle accelerator. Which is, once again, still impressive, but not 40 million times more impressive. But we've still got more stats to discuss. Going back to the type of particle that the oh my god particle even is. Assuming that this particle was a proton to begin with, we can assume its rest mass and do the following calculation to determine how fast the particle was going. I'm not even going to try to pretend to understand what I'm looking at right now, but this is the calculation that scientists use to calculate the speed in which one of these particles is traveling. And I suppose, using this specific formula, assuming that the particle was a proton, then it's safe to assume that this particle is literally traveling at 0.999999999999999999957 times the speed of light. Basically a tiny fraction less than the literal speed of light, which is obviously insane, but we're still not done. The oh my god particle wasn't only fast and energetic, it was also photogenic, or at least photongenic. And what I mean by that is that the oh my god particle literally had 100 quintillion times more photon energy than visible light, which is honestly hard to even conceptualize. But just to put it into context, here's a side-by-side comparison. The oh my god particle was 20 million times more photongenic than the highest photon energy measured ever in electromagnetic radiation. I think it goes without saying that the oh my god particle has definitely earned its name, and just by looking at its stats, it's hard to imagine how rare this type of particle even is. And I do understand that this first section was very much so technical and in the weeds, and these numbers really didn't mean much, but hopefully, if nothing else, the massive multipliers of all of these numbers kind of just goes to show how insane the God particle was, even if you're like me and know nothing about particles at all. The God particle was something really cool that was seen in space, and we're only just getting started.
The Boötes Void. The year is 1981. You are an astronomer working alone, once again, late at night. Today was like any other day, and you were tasked with doing a galactic survey of redshift in the universe. And while the specifics of a redshift survey doesn't matter, what does matter is what you are about to discover. As you are surveying the universe, you notice something you have not seen before. Your monitoring device has gone from receiving a lot of information to essentially no information in the matter of a few degrees. And while at first it looks like the tool you're using has simply stopped working or is no longer working correctly, but after moving it and recalibrating it, you notice that you are getting the same results. To you, this is interesting because this almost reminds you of what happened when you go over a void in the universe. However, this void is different. It's nowhere near the size of the voids you've measured in the past, leading you to believe it's not a void. Although, upon further inspection, you realize that you haven't just discovered a new void in the universe. You have just discovered the largest known void in the visible universe.
And this void is so big, in fact, that it's known as the Great Nothing. This is a terrifying start, and we're only just getting started. In the first section, we talked about so many numbers and facts about something that was very much so real and happening. But the Boötes void is literally the exact opposite. The only numbers I can discuss are the numbers representing the lack that exists within this void. You see, as you look at a map of universe, the more and more you zoom out, the more and more you notice a sort of web or filament structure that exists through all of the superclusters of galaxies in the visible universe. Obviously, the natural byproduct of this web-like structure is the voids or gaps between these clusters. These voids alone aren't necessarily rare, and they're not completely empty either. They do contain smaller galaxies, although they're not nearly as populated as the superclusters that are more observable. Although the reason why the Boötes void is so significant is, well, of course, because of its sheer size. From one end to another, the Boötes void is 330 million light years across. Of course, meaning if you were traveling at the speed of light, it would take you 330 million years to cross it. Now, for context, if the Boötes void wasn't a void and was actually a supercluster, it would be safe to assume that this area of universe could contain up to 2,000 galaxies. However, because the Boötes void is, well, a void, it only contains just 60 galaxies, which, relatively speaking, means it's more or less empty. As of right now, the center of the Boötes void is 700 million light years from Earth. Although, interestingly, if the Milky Way galaxy was put smack dab in the middle of the Boötes void, astronomers on Earth would not have known about any other galaxy until the 1960s. Because of the sheer lack of anything around our galaxy, any technology prior to the 1960s would not have been able to detect any other galaxies. And I can only imagine the scientific revelation happening in the 60s if we were in the middle of the void and had just discovered a new galaxy for the first time. And while voids are common and natural in the universe, something about this void being extremely large is, at the very least, eerie. And just some small part, terrifying.
Dark galaxies.
The year is 1984, and you and your fellow astronomer are in the observatory currently overlooking the Virgo cluster. The Virgo cluster is of particular interest to you because you think it looks cool. But what you are on the verge of discovering goes far beyond just being cool. As you are looking through the Virgo cluster, you notice a weird phenomenon. As you point your telescope in a specific direction, you notice that your telescope appears to be looking at, well, nothing in particular. However, all of your equipment seems to be suggesting that you are looking at a galaxy. This is obviously perplexing because you can see directly that there is no galaxy in your direct line of sight. However, all of the data you are getting seems to be telling a different story. As you look closer through the telescope, you can see a few galaxies in the distance, and perhaps your devices are mistaking two galaxies for one larger, closer galaxy, although based on all of the information you're getting, it appears that you are looking at a galaxy that you almost can't see. And that's when it hits you. You are looking at a galaxy, but you're looking at a galaxy no one has ever seen before. A galaxy known as a dark galaxy, or an ultra-diffuse galaxy. Dark galaxies are quite interesting, and it's taken nearly 30 years of studying them to have a significant amount of information on them. However, the more we study dark galaxies, the more we are left with questions rather than answers. As I described in the intro story, which I totally just made up, I have no idea if that's how astronomy equipment works, it was discovered that yes, dark galaxies are such a thing. Although not much was known about them at the time. Although fast forward to the modern day, we now know a lot more about these interesting and rare galaxies. Dark galaxies or ultra-diffuse galaxies are known as such because they are extremely low in luminosity. They don't produce a lot of light, and they are very hard to see. They're so hard to see, in fact, that they're actually sometimes referred to as see-through galaxies, because it is actually easier to see galaxies further in the distance behind them than it is to see the actual galaxy itself. And the reason why these dark galaxies are so dark is due to their lack of star-forming gas, which results in these galaxies having fewer new stars and being almost exclusively full of old, dying stars. For reference, here's an example on screen. This is a picture of NGC 1052 DF2, and it's a dark galaxy that was discovered in 2018, and we'll discuss it more later, but you basically can't see it. For reference, this is the Milky Way, obviously the iconic swirly ball of light that we all associate with the term galaxy. As you can tell, one of these galaxies is not like the other. Although interestingly, they're not as different as they may seem. Dark galaxies typically have a similar size to our Milky Way. However, the mass of these dark galaxies is much more similar to galaxies that are way more tiny than the Milky Way. For reference, the Milky Way is estimated to have anywhere from 200 to 400 million stars. Although a dark galaxy of the same size would only have roughly 1 billion stars, compared to the nearly 400 billion the Milky Way has. That fact alone makes the whole see-through aspect of a see-through galaxy make a lot more sense. But it definitely doesn't answer every question we have about dark galaxies. From their original discovery in 1984 to the modern day, scientists have observed two opposite traits when it comes to dark galaxies. Some dark galaxies, unsurprisingly, contain an extreme amount of dark matter, and it's believed by scientists that some literally consist almost primarily of dark matter due to the lack of stars. Now, dark matter being present in a galaxy is not surprising whatsoever, and it's believed by most scientists that dark matter is a necessity for galaxies to form. Now, that's all fine and well until you understand that in recent years, like we're talking 2018, there has been dark galaxies that have been discovered with basically no dark matter whatsoever. And what this means, honestly, I don't know, besides the fact that we really don't know much about dark galaxies. But of course, the mystery doesn't end there, because while some dark galaxies have almost all dark matter and some dark galaxies almost have no dark matter, the common denominator between both dark galaxies is the fact that we don't know how they're formed. There are some scientists that theorize that these galaxies are old and formed from the earliest galaxies, which is why they are out of star-forming gas. But yeah, these galaxies are rather mysterious and elusive, and almost kind of seem like the ghosts of galaxies, because you can barely see them, they're translucent, we don't know how they're formed, they're on either end of the extreme when it comes to dark matter, and we still don't know a ton about them. And I guess one more funny fact about dark galaxies, which has nothing to do with the galaxy itself, is that if you go to the Ultra Diffuse Galaxy Wikipedia page, you will see that it's discovered by two men, Alan Sandabich and Bruno Bengelli. And if you hover over Alan's name, it'll show you a picture of him and tell you about all of his credentials. You know, American astronomer from California, blah, blah, blah. But if you hover over Bruno, there is no picture, and all it says is, Bruno Bengelli is a Swiss curler. And I can only assume this is like an incorrect hyperlink, but if this is accurate, that's kind of hilarious. And it also reminds me of that one like Impractical Joker sketch where Q and Murr are giving a presentation, and Q gives all of his credentials when introducing himself, and then Murr has to introduce himself as Dandy Chiggins with no qualifications whatsoever. But yeah, dark galaxies are weird, and for the longest time, we didn't even know they were there.
Rogue planets.
Have you ever been laying on your bed on a Friday night, no texts on your phone, no messages, no calls, just you watching your favorite YouTube video, eating a snack, all by yourself? To some, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. And to some, that sounds like pure bliss. But the common denominator in both situations is that you are alone, or lonely. And while some of us experience loneliness more than others, nobody on this planet could imagine, let alone experience, the loneliness that a rogue planet experiences. When you think of planets, obviously you think of rock or gas formations floating around a sun, and in most cases, that is exactly what a planet is. But what if I told you there was a nearly countless number of planets that had no sun and no orbit whatsoever? They are simply flying aimlessly through space. No friends, no direction, just inertia and loneliness. Now, I actually want to take a step back and unpack this a bit, because if you listen closely, you'd notice I say nearly countless number of rogue planets, and that is the case. For context, in the Milky Way alone, as I mentioned earlier, there's anywhere from 200 to 400 billion stars. And let's say on average, there's 5 planets orbiting each of those stars. Assuming there is 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, that would mean that there is 2 trillion planets in our Milky Way galaxy that are orbiting stars. That alone is an insane number. However, it is estimated by scientists and astronomers that there is likely more rogue planets in the Milky Way than there is stars and starbound planets in the Milky Way combined. I don't know about you, but to me, that information when I first heard it was insane. And it's probably even more insane if you are just now hearing about rogue planets for the first time. But the lore goes deeper. For starters, we need to discuss how these lone wolf planets even come to be. And there is actually 2 primary methods. The first method of rogue planet creation actually starts with a starbound planet. You see, sometimes when a planet in a solar system is misbehaving, other planets gang up to use their gravitational powers to eject that planet from the solar system. And in case the term gravitational powers wasn't enough of a giveaway, I just made that up. But the truth isn't too far from that fiction. There are very real instances where gravitational interactions happen between planets in solar systems that end up ejecting planets from solar systems entirely, leading them on a brand new trajectory that has no formal orbit, turning a once starbound planet into a rogue planet, completely shifting life as that planet had known it. The other way that rogue planets are formed are through the same process that stars used to form. The only difference is, however, that rogue planets that form through this process do not gain the mass required to become a star and do not essentially ignite, turning into, well, what a star becomes. And interestingly, it's believed that most of the rogue planets are formed through this method. And most of the planets that form through this method are large gas giants, unsurprisingly, and they're actually typically warm, not the freezing cold wasteland you would assume a rogue planet to be. Now, interestingly, there is some debate on whether or not planets formed through this method are actually planets or if they're brown dwarf stars. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to consider them planets. Also because these rogue planets are really the only rogue planets we have information about. Simply because these massive gas giant rogue planets are the easiest to observe and study because they are somewhat just barely visible due to their size and small amount of light, which is in direct contrast to the smaller rock planets that are essentially invisible to image detection used by astronomers. And it's for that reason that studying rogue planets is extremely hard. They have no known trajectory, they don't even have a purpose, there's nothing around them, no light source, and they are simply lone wolves on their own mission. So just remember that if you ever feel lonely laying in your bed, there are planets in our very galaxy that are light years from any solar system, and even those solar systems that they are closest to are still impossibly far away, and also not their home. And their home was either a place that they were rejected from or never even had in the first place. But in case you feel rejected or like you need a home, feel free to subscribe to the Trust Me Bro channel, because we are always accepting new bros, and we have the best community on YouTube. Oh, and we also post cool videos every Friday. So if you like videos like this one, definitely feel free to subscribe, and maybe even like the video if you want a part 2 about crazy things in space. But enough of that, back to the video.
The Space Angels. The year is 1984, and you are a Russian cosmonaut aboard the Soviet space station, Salyut 7. Aboard the space station with you are 2 fellow cosmonauts, and the 3 of you were on the space station to conduct low-orbit experiments. But while spending time in space and working as an astronaut may seem like a dream come true to many, to you and your team, your time in space was anything but pleasant. During your time on the space station, you and your team experienced fuel leaks, loss of power, and other critical errors that demanded a lot of mental and physical attention. And it was for that reason, near the end of your trip, you were excited to come home. Although, in one of the final days on your stay in the Soviet space station, you and your 2 colleagues experienced something you have never seen before. The day was ending like any other. However, you were noticing something your colleagues were not. It almost seemed like the cabin of the space station was filling up with some sort of orange dust. Not physical dust, but almost a thick orange light. But almost after you began to process what you could be looking at, you notice a bright light filling the cabin. And this light was observed not only by you, but by the 2 other cosmonauts as well. But the bright light that filled the cabin seemed almost blinding, and you had to shield your eyes. That is, until moments later, it appeared to subside, and you decide to look out the window of the space station to see what is going on. And it is at this moment when you and your cosmonaut colleagues look out the window and see something you have never seen before. These massive figures seem to have wings, faces, and they are comparable to the size of multi-story buildings. They are a bright orange light, and they have a calm, smiling demeanor and appear to just be observing the station. At first, you had to imagine that you were simply losing your mind, although when your 2 colleagues confirmed that they had seen the same thing, you were all left in awe, as what you have just seen seemed impossible. And only moments later, what you had just been looking at was gone, and you were only left with the memory of one of the most insane things you could ever see in space. Not many days after this experience, you are picked up from your ship and brought home, and once home, you begin to retell the story of what you saw, and the legend of the Space Angel of Salyut 7 begins. For the last entry on this video, I definitely wanted to kind of switch it up, and obviously this isn't a scientific discovery. This is definitely more or less of a debated phenomenon that is still not understood to this day. And well, I wanted to leave things, I guess, on a cliffhanger. Unlike every other entry in this video, this sighting or reporting wasn't discovered by a scientist on ground. It was discovered by a cosmonaut literally in a space station. And for those who don't know, a cosmonaut is simply a Russian astronaut. Now, back to this insane story. Every single member of the crew that was on the space station confirmed that they saw these massive angels for multiple minutes, and each one of them told the exact same story about what they saw. Now, interestingly, when they came back to Earth to tell the story of what they saw at the end of their trip, it was all written off almost immediately. People were claiming that they all shared the same hallucination, and for that reason, this information wasn't necessarily made public until the fall of the Soviet Union years later. Interestingly, these glowing angelic figures were not only seen by the first crew of Salyut 7, and it was reported that another crew years later also witnessed the exact same phenomenon.
Although the scientific community was very quick to strongly reject any sort of supernatural beings actually being present during this sighting. One of the theories that scientists presented to try to make sense of this entire situation was that what they were seeing was an extreme case of atmospheric and optical effects combined with human perception under stress. Now, it was known that the missions that these crews embarked on the Soviet space station were not pleasant in the slightest. They both encountered numerous issues, and also being in space in general is not an easy task. And it's for that reason that it's not unlikely for there to be some sort of, well, mind tricks at play, but that doesn't explain everything. And another theory suggests that there is probably some sort of rare plasma or aura-like phenomenon reacting with sunlight at the orbital altitude that the space station was at, creating this interesting visual phenomenon, which isn't impossible, but it's also not confirmed. This story, while interesting, has no concrete ending and is kind of still to this day open to interpretation. And in the comments below, I kind of want to start a conversation of what you guys think this could be. I know I didn't give too much information, but if multiple groups of cosmonauts saw the same thing on multiple times, could it be that they were all simply sharing a hallucination? Could it be that they were all under the same mental stress? Could it be the perfect Goldilocks zone for some sort of plasma-induced light? Or was there something more at play here? I personally have no idea, and this could be supernatural or nothing of the sort. And maybe all of these cosmonauts were just lying just for a gag, but realistically, we don't know, and the truth is we likely never will. Which, for that reason, might make this the craziest and potentially scariest entry on the entire list.
The craziest heist that actually worked. The Mona Lisa mystery. In October of 2025, only 5 months ago from the date of recording this video, the famous French museum, the Louvre, was robbed for over 88 million pounds in jewelry. The entire heist only took 8 minutes, and out of those 8 minutes, thieves only spent 4 within the museum itself. This heist took place in daylight hours, and almost immediately after it happened, it made national headlines, and I'm assuming that most of you remember hearing about it, at least in some capacity. As of right now, charges have been filed against 5 suspects in relation to that robbery. However, the whereabouts of those missing jewels are still unknown to this very day. And while that heist is recent and noteworthy, it's actually not the heist I'm going to be discussing. Because, believe it or not, it's not the most expensive or most significant robbery that's taken place at the Louvre. And in my opinion, the most expensive and significant heist that took place at the Louvre actually dates all the way back to 1911, when the Louvre experienced its first documented heist, which resulted in the Mona Lisa being stolen for years. Let me paint a picture for you. No pun intended.
Vincenzo Perugia was born on October 8th, 1881 in Italy. He spent his childhood and young adult life living in a small village on the border of Italy and Switzerland. But due to a lack of local career opportunities, Vincenzo decided to move to Paris. And quickly, he was able to secure work. Vincenzo picked up a job at the Louvre, possibly one of the most iconic landmarks in all of Paris, if not all of France. And while his job was modest and simple, he was still able to play a significant role in the institution. Vincenzo's job primarily consisted of cleaning and framing paintings, as well as constructing strong cases for some of the more expensive artwork. One notable piece being the Mona Lisa. Vincenzo, unfortunately, didn't hold this job for long, and from 1908 to 1911, he ended up working different odd jobs around Paris. That was until the summer of 1911, when he decided to do the job of a lifetime. Fed up with doing random construction jobs around Paris, Vincenzo wanted to make a big sum of money. And he also wanted to do something patriotic for his country. And he decided the best way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone was by using his expertise to steal the Mona Lisa and then bring it back to Italy, where he could sell it and return it to its rightful country of origin. But we'll get to that. On August 20th, 1911, Vincenzo entered the Louvre only minutes before it closed. He was dressed in what was known as a traditional smock, and it was essentially a white lab coat that Louvre employees would wear. Vincenzo knew this from working there previously and was able to get almost an exact replica, something that would come in handy later on. Since he entered the Louvre so late, he knew he only had minutes to try to find the perfect hiding spot before he would be asked to leave. And once again, because of his experience working there, he was able to quickly find a closet and set up camp for the night. The following morning at 7 a.m., August the 21st, Vincenzo awoke from his likely uncomfortable storage closet slumber and began to execute on his plan. Immediately after exiting the closet, he was met with nobody. And that's because this Monday, like every Monday during the summer at the time, the Louvre was closed, which meant that security and foot traffic were at an all-time low. By 7:15 a.m., Vincenzo had made his way to the Salon Carré, the room where the Mona Lisa and other notorious paintings were held. That's right, believe it or not, there was a time when the Mona Lisa did not have its own special room. Regardless, due to his experience working with these exact paintings, Vincenzo was able to quickly and expertly remove the Mona Lisa off the wall and bring it to a secluded staircase where he could remove it from its frame, the very frame he was very likely involved in the construction of, explaining why he was able to so quickly and expertly, once again, remove the painting from the frame. So far, every aspect of his plan had gone off without a hitch. He covered the painting with his white smock and tucked them both under his arm, as if it was a free newspaper. And to Vincenzo, this plan almost seemed too easy. That was until he tried to leave the Louvre. As he tried to use the exit in the stairway, he was met with one major problem: a locked door. Vincenzo had no keys to the Louvre, and because he stayed overnight and this was the day the Louvre was closed, there was likely only locked doors surrounding the entire premises, meaning he was potentially locked in there until the following day. However, almost instantly after all hope had seemed lost, Vincenzo was met with his saving grace. A plumber making his way down the staircase just so happened to notice Vincenzo looking perplexed at the locked back door, and this plumber, wanting to be polite and assuming this employee was simply struggling with a door, offered to unlock the door for him and allow him to go about his day, a gesture that Vincenzo accepted gratefully. After being let out of the Louvre with the Mona Lisa hidden under his arm only minutes after emerging from the storage closet, Vincenzo was on his way back to his apartment with one of the most iconic pieces of art ever made. And one of the craziest parts is, no one was the wiser for over 24 hours. And that's because the following day when the Louvre reopened, a photography session was taking place for a majority of the Louvre's art, meaning a lot of art was being taken on and off the wall all day. And for that reason, people simply assumed that the Mona Lisa was being photographed. However, the following day, when the Mona Lisa was the only piece of art to not be returned after being photographed, people started to become concerned. And it quickly became obvious that somebody had stolen the Louvre's girl. Once the museum made the official decision to declare the Mona Lisa stolen, they contacted authorities, and almost instantly detectives were at the scene, and the national border of France started being closely monitored to ensure no trafficking of the painting outside of the country. However, even with that measure being taken, the search for the Mona Lisa quickly became a global pursuit, and the reward for information that would lead to the recovery of the Mona Lisa quickly rose to over $250,000. After the public was informed that the Mona Lisa was stolen and that there was a major cash prize for any information potentially leading to its recovery, the authorities were bombarded with an overwhelming amount of tips, all essentially contradicting each other, leaving almost no recognizable patterns for authorities to work off of. However, that doesn't mean they didn't have any suspects. While the authorities at this point were essentially questioning anybody that had almost any relationship to the Louvre, two notable suspects were Pablo Picasso and Vincenzo himself. Pablo Picasso was a notable suspect simply because he was a known art thief, or at least a purchaser of stolen art. Somebody who had stolen statues from the Louvre in the past admitted that they had stolen statues from the Louvre and sold them to Pablo Picasso. And when authorities investigated these claims, they were able to find that, yes, the same statues that this individual had claimed to stolen and sold were currently in Pablo Picasso's home. And it was for that reason that he was heavily questioned by the police. However, they were not convinced he had any involvement, which led them to question every employee of the Louvre, past and present, which led them to Vincenzo. However, even though he was a suspect, he was not a prime suspect, simply because his employment there was brief and not necessarily high level. And each time that the authorities talked to him, he made a convincing case that he had no idea what was going on and he had no involvement whatsoever. Little did the investigators know that every time they entered Vincenzo's apartment, they were literally within smelling distance of the Mona Lisa. And that's because Vincenzo had hidden the Mona Lisa in the bottom of a chest he kept in his apartment and then covered it with a false floor to make it look like an empty chest. However, that empty chest just so happened to contain a piece of art that is now worth over $1 billion. But we'll get to that. For over 2 years after the heist, Vincenzo lived a normal life, keeping the Mona Lisa just sitting in a trunk in his apartment. However, after these 2 years, he was fed up with having it sitting there doing nothing, and he decided it was time to return the painting to his homeland, a place he believed the painting belonged. And not for no reason either. Leonardo da Vinci did paint the Mona Lisa in Florence, Italy. However, the Mona Lisa wasn't stolen from Italy by Napoleon as Vincenzo thought. In reality, the Mona Lisa was actually gifted to King Francis I by Leonardo da Vinci when he moved to France 250 years before Napoleon was ever even born. Regardless, Vincenzo wrote an anonymous letter to an art dealer in Florence offering them the real Mona Lisa. And while skeptical, this art dealer invited Vincenzo to meet him in Florence in a hotel. And Vincenzo traveled with his trunk from Paris to Florence, where he met with the dealer in the hotel, showed him the Mona Lisa, and tried to conduct a deal. The art dealer told Vincenzo that his patriotic move was very much so appreciated, And while he wanted to make a deal, he needed to ensure the painting was authentic first, and for that reason, he had to get it examined by his team. Vincenzo accepted these terms and waited in his hotel, only for there to be a knock on the door only an hour later. Although this wasn't a quick approval of authenticity, it was the police who came to arrest Vincenzo. You see, once the art dealer successfully had the Mona Lisa in his possession, he decided to contact authorities, which they were eager to respond, and Vincenzo was promptly arrested. Although, even though the scale of his crime was massive, his punishment was relatively small. He ended up only spending 7 months in prison, and it's reported that he was given a lighter sentence due to his patriotic intentions with the painting. However, in recent times, experts actually question whether or not he was trying to be patriotic or simply using that as an excuse. Because Vincenzo wasn't trying to donate the painting to an Italian museum, he was trying to sell it to an Italian art dealer, meaning he was at least partially motivated by profit as well. Regardless, if you wanted to know what it was like to steal the world's most important and expensive painting, here you go. Although, be warned, the Louvre has slightly more security than it did over 100 years ago. And with its massive increase in value, the Mona Lisa has also been given much more stringent security measures. And I don't think that doing some sort of night at the museum style sleepover and costume would kind of get you the same results in 2026. Regardless, this simple heist was likely successful because of its simplicity, and in my opinion, undoubtedly had a massive impact on history, at least in the realm of art heists. But with that being said, let's move on to a classic bank heist.
The Northern Bank Heist. It is December 19th, 2004.
Chris Ward is spending time with his family in his house in Northern Ireland. Chris Ward works for the Northern Bank, and being in the middle of the holiday season has made his work extremely stressful, making any time he's able to spend with his family that much more precious. Although this night was unlike any other night he's ever had with his family, because during the time simply watching soccer, or I guess football, Chris receives a knock on the door. However, it wasn't Christmas carolers looking to sing for him and his family. It was a man saying he wanted to discuss football. However, after letting this man in, and then 2 mysterious men following this man into his home, the true intentions of these strangers were almost instantly revealed. The strangers, now intruders in Chris's home, instantly draw weapons, point them directly at his family, and tell Chris that they know he works at the Northern Bank, and they're going to use his access to rob the bank. And if he doesn't want to help cooperate, his entire family is going to die. Terrified and not wanting to end the lives of everybody he loves, Chris follows the orders of these men, and they tell him that he needs to collect his work clothes immediately and get into the car waiting outside. The men inform Chris that they are going to stay behind and watch his family, and they reassure him that as long as he follows every single one of their commands, his family will remain alive. However, if he disobeys the gunmen, his family will pay the price. Not left with many options, Chris collects his work uniform and enters the vehicle outside, where the driver points another gun at Chris and takes him to a secluded location. While Chris Ward is being held hostage in a vehicle en route to who knows where, his supervisor at the Northern Bank, Kevin McCullen, has experienced a similar situation. 2 men knocked on Kevin's door pretending to be police officers. They ask him to quickly step outside regarding a family situation, and as soon as Kevin steps outside, he is met with a gun in the face, and both him and his wife are quickly apprehended. Kevin's wife is blindfolded and taken away by one of the men, and Kevin is told that she is going to be taken to a safe location, and in 24 hours, if he does everything they say, he will return her to him completely unharmed. At that point, Kevin's wife is taken away, Kevin is restrained in his spare room, and Chris just so happens to arrive at this secluded location, aka Kevin's house, although in a separate room. Eventually, both Kevin and Chris were brought into the living room of Kevin's apartment, and the mastermind behind this plot made his plan very clear. The main captor of Kevin and Chris tells them both that they are going to conduct a robbery of their work, and they are going to do so flawlessly if they want to see their family or loved ones alive. The captor gives the men vague details of how the plan is going to go down, but primarily uses this time to enforce authority and respect, rather than spilling the beans too early. The captor then gives both of these men flip phones that only contain 1 number in the contact book. The contact, of course, being a burner phone owned by the captor. And for the rest of that night, Kevin and Chris sat helplessly in Kevin's apartment, waiting for the following day when they would be forced to not only betray their employer, but to embark on the largest bank heist in UK history. Following a long night of interrogation and intimidation, the sun finally rises, and the 2 men are instructed to get ready for work as normal. And as 11 a.m. rolls around, the 2 men are sent out of the house, being reminded of the stakes and told to act as if nothing was happening. Both Kevin and Chris arrive at work at 11:30 and 12, and as instructed, they go about their day as if nothing was happening. You see, Kevin and Chris weren't targeted randomly. One of the 2 were actually key holders, and they both had direct access to cash, as it directly correlated to their jobs, meaning that they were perfect targets for this heist. From 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., nothing out of the normal happened. Besides the fact that both Kevin and Chris had to use the phones they were provided to call their captors 3 times throughout the day and to ensure that the captors had an opportunity to once again remind them both of the stakes. At exactly 5 p.m., the time when the bank closes, Kevin and Chris both make up an excuse of why they need to stay after hours. An excuse they come to is that they need to recount the cash as today was so busy and they didn't have the proper time to accurately count everything in the vault. This was a valid excuse that didn't raise any eyebrows. And as every other employee of the bank left, Chris and Kevin were the only 2 people in the bank besides 2 security guards. As instructed, Kevin and Chris both make their way down to the vault and use their credentials to enter it without triggering any alarms. The bank vault in the Northern Bank actually requires 2 separate employees to have access cards to open the vault, and the 2 employees that hold these access cards are swapped weekly, meaning that whoever put this heist together knew exactly who to target at the exact right time. But we'll discuss that more later. As the 2 men entered the vault, they began the next phase of the operation. They began to fill a duffel bag full of big bills, 50 and 100-pound sterling notes, and in a roughly 15-minute time period, they were able to put over £1 million into one duffel bag. As instructed, once the money is in the bag, Chris calls the captors once again to be informed on where he needs to go, and the captor tells him that he needs to take this duffel bag to a bus stop directly outside of the bank. Chris follows those instructions, and as he arrives at the meetup location, a car arrives, takes the duffel bag, and to Chris and Kevin, their nightmare is finally over. The job is done, they gave them what they wanted, and nobody knows. That was until Chris started walking back towards the bank and received another phone call. Obviously, it was the captors, and they told him that the mission wasn't quite done yet. The first million they got out of the bank was the first of many, and was more of a loyalty test than a heist. And now the true mission begins. Chris was informed that him and Kevin had to go back into the vault and basically fill every metal box they could find with cash and bring those metal boxes to the back door where delivery trucks will arrive and take them away. Now, obviously, this is much easier said than done, and the way that they're able to do this successfully is quite unique. After Kevin and Chris arrive back into the vault, they fill as many metal boxes as they can with cash. These metal boxes individually can fit anywhere from £500,000 to £1 million, and they get to work filling 12 different metal boxes on 2 separate carts. But the work isn't done yet, because now they need to take these 2 carts to the loading bay, which is the only place that cash can go in and out of the bank in bulk, which requires passing security guards and also going to a road that is only accessible to licensed vehicles. How Chris and Kevin end up doing this successfully is they put the money in boxes that are usually intended for waste paper, not actual cash. And Kevin and Chris are both able to use their seniority at the bank in relationship with the security guards to convince them to allow an unauthorized vehicle for a delivery, claiming there was too much waste paper due to the holiday and they needed a third-party service to take the waste paper away, and that it was okay. And while the security guards agreed to allow an unauthorized vehicle into the loading bay, they insisted they stand watch just in case. And just like that, Chris, Kevin, and a security guard stand at the loading bay, and a random unmarked truck arrives. 2 men step out of the truck, and all 5 of them load all of the waste paper into this van. And while at this point it would seem like, of course, the nightmare is now finally over, it wasn't quite yet, because one of the men driving this truck handed Kevin a roll of garbage bags, and then left in the truck. Kevin and Chris knew what these garbage bags were meant for, and they quickly returned back to the vault and put all of the money that was left over that wasn't in the initial duffel bag or in the metal tins into these garbage bags. And surprisingly, Kevin and Chris were able to fit over £5 million into garbage bags. However, the hard part was moving these garbage bags past security. They already got rid of the waste paper, so what could this possibly be? And while the mission seemed impossible, Kevin and Chris had no other option. As the 2 men walked past the security guard wheeling multiple carts full of overfilled garbage bags, shockingly, the security guards did not bat an eye. Likely because it was assumed these men were doing simple cleanup after hours. And it does make sense considering these men had allegedly just gotten rid of a ton of waste paper, so potentially there was other waste paper or waste products that needed to be taken care of. Kevin and Chris once again make it to the loading bay, and they're once again accompanied by a security guard. And they all waited together for 45 minutes for the van to come back and pick up all of the garbage bags. During those 45 minutes, if the security guard even questioned what was in the bags at any point, the entire operation could have been blown up. However, that simply never happened. And after these garbage bags were loaded into the truck, the unassuming-looking robbers informed Kevin and Chris that their job was finally done, and that they could finally go home. However, at this point, even though the heist was complete, the hell for these men was not. After safely making his way home, Kevin Mullen immediately called authorities and reported that he was used in a crime to rob over £30 million from the bank that he worked at, and almost instantly an investigation was underway. However, he would likely come to regret this call, as during the investigation of the biggest heist in UK history, police actually ended up putting Kevin in jail for over a year while he awaited trial because they assumed he had to be involved because of how perfect this heist was. However, after that year investigation, they had to admit that they had nothing, and Kevin was set free, after now becoming a hostage of both criminals and the law. Following them letting Kevin go, they quickly turned their sights to Chris. Although, after a multi-year investigation into Chris, they also found that he was too innocent and not an insider. And while this entire situation took place over 22 years ago now, in 2004, as of today, nobody has been arrested for the actual heist or robbery of the Northern Bank. And the roughly 30 million pounds that was stolen was never recovered. Now, in the year following the robbery, there was 22 investigations that took place and 13 arrests. However, every single one of these arrests that took place only resulted in money laundering charges at best, and there was never a connection made to the people who actually perpetrated the heist itself. Only accessories, if you will. Possibly making the Northern Bank heist one of the, if not the biggest successful independent bank heist in human history. But we're still not done. Really quickly, I just wanted to say, believe it or not, this is the first video I've ever made about heists, and there is so many to talk about. If you guys want it, there is a heist-based video I want to make that revolves around weird heists. Like, for example, there's somebody who stole an entire transport truck full of Nutella, and that was never found. But I didn't know if that's too weird if you guys would want to see it. But regardless, if you guys want more heist videos, leave a like or leave a comment below. Oh, and by the way, according to YouTube, only roughly 30% of you guys watching this video right now are actually subscribed. So if you like my videos and want to see a brand new one every single Friday, hit that subscribe button and become a bro today. Now, with all of the shameless self-promo out of the way, let's get to the next and final heist on this list.
The Kim Kardashian heist. It was Paris Fashion Week in 2016, and everybody who was anybody was in Paris. Kim Kardashian had just touched down, and she was making her way to her hotel. Where she was staying was known as one of the, if not the most luxurious hotels in all of France. It was known as the Hotel des Portelles, and the room that Kim had booked cost over $16,000 per night. Though not for no reason. Not only was this hotel luxurious, but it was known for its security and anonymity for celebrities. Access to this building was hidden behind gates, it had no marked address, and there was no formal lobby, only a simple courtyard with a concierge. At face value, this seems like one of the best places to be. However, for Kim Kardashian, this hotel ended up being the place she would have one of the most terrifying experiences of her entire life. After making it to the hotel and arriving to her room, Kim was quick to post to social media, making it known that she was at Paris Fashion Week and that she was at one of the best hotels money could buy. However, this simple social media update wasn't as harmless as it seemed, as criminals in Paris were already plotting on robbing one of the celebrities to roll through their town. All they needed to do was pick one. And due to Kim Kardashian's massive online presence and habit at the time of posting live updates, she became the prime target for some of the most notorious jewelry thieves in all of France. Late into the night on October 2nd, 2016, after following almost every one of her updates online for days, 5 men decided to make a move. After gathering supplies and strategically planning, they disguised themselves as police officers and made their way to the exclusive hotel. Not only were these men disguised, but they were also armed. And using these disguises and weapons, they were able to quickly not only make their way into the courtyard, but into the hotel, threatening staff members at gunpoints and forcing them to lead them directly to Kim Kardashian's room. At this point, the men began to split up. One of the robbers stood on the street entrance of the hotel to ensure that nobody was entering. Following that, 2 of the men stayed in the courtyard to ensure that nobody from inside the hotel was trying to leave. And then the last 2 men took the concierge at gunpoint directly to Kim Kardashian's room. After the concierge brought the 2 men to Kim Kardashian's room, they forced the concierge to open the door, and both men entered the room, weapons drawn, pointing directly at Kim Kardashian. They yelled at her in French, told her to get onto the floor, and they bound her hands with zip ties, taped her feet together and taped her mouth closed, and then also bound the concierge and hid them both in a bathroom. One of the robbers stood in the bathroom, keeping them both at gunpoint, while the other man quickly dug through all of Kim's luggage and began collecting her jewelry. While Kim was in the bathroom, held at gunpoint, she let out a scream that woke up one of her friends that was also in the same suite. The suite was a multi-floor suite, meaning that her friend was essentially a floor below her. But when she was awoken to a scream, she knew something was wrong. So she locked herself in a separate bathroom and called Kim's bodyguard, who at the time was at the club with Kim's sisters. But unfortunately, this call was useless, because by the time that the bodyguard would arrive at the hotel, every single one of the robbers would be gone. And almost hilariously, they escaped on bike. That's right, the men who had just broken into a hotel and robbed Kim Kardashian at gunpoint, stealing a total of over $10 million worth of jewelry, left the scene of the crime on bikes.
But that's not even the craziest part of the story. I'm gonna reveal that in just a sec. After the bodyguard arrived in the hotel, he cleared all of the rooms, found Kim, and unbound her in the concierge. And then they quickly notified the authorities. When the police arrived, unfortunately, they weren't able to do much, as at a first glance, there was absolutely no evidence. No fingerprints, no bullet casings, no tire marks. This heist was committed by professionals, although it wasn't the perfect crime. For weeks following the heist, Kim was left traumatized, $10 million poor, and police had almost no leads, making the situation look rather bleak. That was until investigators were able to find a small trace of DNA that were left on the plastic bindings used on Kim Kardashian's wrist. However, there was no exact match at that time, but that didn't mean they could get one. Over the next 3 months, police began building cases against every known criminal that could have possibly been involved. And then, all in one morning, police engaged in 17 raids at once of all potential suspects, storming their homes and gathering them for questioning. And interestingly, even though not all of those 17 individuals were involved, all 5 of the actual robbers were a part of those 17, meaning that the police did have their suspects, they just didn't know it yet. And from then on, it would take multiple years of a slow, grueling court proceeding for the truth to be revealed and justice to finally be served. Although the results may not be what you think. It wouldn't be until April of 2025 that the trials for the suspects would finally take place. Just for context, that's 9 years after the robbery took place. Regardless, 10 individuals were on trial. The 5 men who conducted the robbery and 5 additional accessories. Now, interestingly, it was on this trial that it became publicly known that almost everybody involved in this heist was elderly. For example, the 2 men that held Kim Kardashian at gunpoint during the robbery were both 60 years old at the time of the robbery, meaning that during the time of the trial, they were nearly 70 years old. And some of the other robbers involved were well into their 70s, which is why at the time the media was calling these robbers the Grandpa Gang or the Grandpa Robbers. And rightfully so. Regardless, the result of the trials came in May of 2025. And it was concluded that 8 of the 10 individuals on trial were found guilty. And out of those 8, one of the individuals who was considered the ringleader was given 8 years in prison. And the other 7 were given 3 to 8 years. However, none of them actually will serve prison time. And that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, because a lot of these suspects already served time in pre-trial detention. And secondly, because most of the robbers were in their 60s or 70s, with the oldest robber being 79, the court openly decided to not impose harsher sentences to ensure they stayed out of jail, simply because of their age. And whether or not that's right, I'll let you be the judge. But to me, it's kind of ridiculous how you can not only rob somebody at gunpoint, but do so and take over $10 million of personal valuables only to be caught in a 9-year-long legal proceeding, then just to be served basically a slap on the wrist because you're old. A tiny morbid bit of me thinks it's kind of hilarious to imagine 5 old people robbing Kim Kardashian at gunpoint only to escape on bikes with over $10 million worth of loot. But it's also important to recognize that while some of you may claim that $10 million is nothing to her, in reality, monetary value aside, those items had sentimental value. And besides that, this situation is traumatizing. Kim reportedly stated that she believed she was going to lose her life in this event, which isn't unreasonable at all. And regardless of fame or status, Kim is somebody's daughter, somebody's mom, somebody's ex-wife, and somebody's favorite movie star. And that's why I always like to emphasize whenever I discuss crimes that there are real victims in these situations. And we should try to be empathetic and sympathetic to our fellow humans.
The craziest scams in every time period. The Stone Age. Admittedly, this section is going to be rather short, for a couple of reasons. Primarily being that the Stone Age is literally prehistoric, meaning that everything I'm about to discuss is essentially speculative. Also, because most of human life in the Stone Age was extremely simple, meaning that at this point, human life wasn't even able to comprehend the possibility of deception. If you had something that another human wanted, there was 2 options. Either they kill you to get the thing, or they die trying to kill you to get that thing. That was realistically the extent of scams in the Stone Age. Keep in mind, the Stone Age literally extends over 3.4 million years worth of history. The Stone Age contains 99.3% of all recorded human history, dating back around 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared. So with that being said, what are some scams that could have possibly existed in the Stone Age? And let me present you a few interesting opportunities. Scam number 1, the made you look scam. Here's how the scam goes. You are a caveman, and your enemy, also a caveman, comes to ask you a question. You decide you
you've had enough of his antics and point in the direction that's behind him. This caveman turns around, you pull out your trusty club and hit him in the head. Now, your enemy is dead, and you have just successfully committed a Stone Age scam. In modern terms, that's not much of a scam at all. When it comes to prehistoric humans, things were simple. Just think about that one episode of SpongeBob that took place in the prehistoric times. That's kind of what we're working with here. But besides the petty theft and petty murder of the Stone Age, I believe one of the biggest scams out of the Stone Age was actually the existence of the Stone Age itself. You see, the Stone Age primarily is defined by its use of stone tools, specifically near the very end of the Stone Age. And this is because humans using stone tools signifies the evolution of human creativity, human engineering, human development. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, we need this human development. This isn't a scam at all. This is beautiful. This is progress. And what I would say to you is, not really. Because look where it's gotten us. As humans, we used to sleep outside under the stars, do whatever we wanted all day, go to the bathroom anywhere. We essentially lived like animals, and it was great. Just look how good your dog or cat has it right now. We used to live like them, but now we wake up to an alarm, we go to a job, we commute, we have anxiety, we have bills. Our bills even have bills at this point. So although the scam may have not taken place in the Stone Age, it definitely started in the Stone Age. And potentially one of the biggest scams of the Stone Age was that one meddling, weaselly little caveman that decided to combine a stick with a rock. And maybe if he was the one who got clubbed, we would still be living that sweet animalistic lifestyle. This first section was a bit silly, but I didn't want to leave this Stone Age out of a video about every time period. But with that being said, as we now transition into recorded history, the scams are going to be historically documented and much more serious. But this is a Trust Me Bro video, so don't expect a documentary. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James. The Bronze Age. Not LeBron's Age. The Bronze Age. Yes, that was corny, and yes, we're keeping it in. We are now in the Bronze Age, the beginning of recorded scams. And the scam I'm going to be speaking about from the Bronze Age involves metal fraud, and also includes the earliest ever recorded customer complaint. Let me explain. The year is circa 1750 BC, right near the end of the Bronze Age. And there is a famous copper merchant named Ea Nasser. Ea Nasser, unsurprisingly, would buy and sell metals, specifically copper. And this merchant was no stranger to customer complaints, with one of the most famous examples coming from a customer named Nani. Nani's specific issue with Ea Nasser was that Ea Nasser was selling bad quality or low quality copper, and that was a big issue for Nani. Unlike the Stone Age, I'm not just making this up. This transaction and subsequent complaint is recorded in commercial tablets. These tablets were actually unearthed with a group of other tablets recording transactions and complaints about the copper quality. And these were all found in a home that was believed to at one point been owned by Ea Nasser, which is by itself just a really cool piece of history. Ea Nasser was a well-known copper merchant in his city and was even a member of an established and, relatively speaking, respected copper guild, meaning that he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. However, these credentials definitely didn't help him with his business dealings, because although he may have been surrounded by proper, integral copper merchants, Ea Nasser was likely nothing of the sort. And this is proven by the famous tablet sent to Ea Nasser from Nani, which has actually been translated, and I'm about to read exactly what Nani said to Ea Nasser, and I'll let you decide whether or not Ea Nasser was a scammer. The tablet reads as follows. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimosin fine quality copper ingots. You left, but then you did not do what you promised. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If you do not want to take them, go away. Who do you take me for, that you treat someone like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back empty-handed several times. And that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Dilmun who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak in such a way. While I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Shubi Abum has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we had both had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Shamash. How have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. That was long, but I wanted to give you the exact full quote because I think it's extremely interesting, and I think that Nani is being rather patient and has more than enough reason to be upset. To summarize, Ea Nasser, at least to Nani, is selling low quality copper, And not only is he selling a low-quality product, but he's promising a high-quality product. And when questioned by the servants that are going to pick up the product, he is not nice at all. He's very combative within these transactions. And not only that, he's also refusing to give a full or even partial refund to Nani after his complaint. And Nani has sent multiple messengers to collect a refund. And what does Nasir do? Turns him away empty-handed and sends him through enemy territory to risk the life of the messenger just to add insult to injury for Nani. I don't know about you, but if I was Nani, I would definitely be sending somebody else to Nasir's door that wasn't a messenger looking for my money back. But even after all of this, Nani isn't even refusing to deal with Nasir anymore. He's just saying that once he gets the copper from Nasir, he's going to go through and verify the quality himself before he buys it, which is something he likely should have been doing, but I guess didn't feel like he had to be doing because he was buying from a merchant in the Copper Guild. But lesson learned on Nani's part, check your metal as you buy it. So yeah, this one tablet that was found thousands of years after it was created went on to solidify Nasir as one of the most notorious Bronze Age businessmen and scammers.
The Iron Age.
The Iron Age is a very interesting time period, and it represents a change of power, at least in the world of metals, as the Iron Age literally represents iron becoming the prominent metal that is being mined, forged, and fashioned into tools and ornaments and armor. And the reason that transition was made is kind of a long story, but the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was harsh, and humanity as a whole took a step backwards before it could take 2 steps forwards as it transitioned from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. However, the Iron Age is not free from scams, and it itself has a very interesting laundry list of scams that took place, with the one that I'm going to focus on involving silver coinage, debasement, and hyperinflation. Admittedly, the scam I'm about to discuss kind of bleeds out of the Iron Age, but I had other scams I wanted to associate with other time periods, so although this specific scam doesn't take place in the Iron Age, it definitely has its roots in the Iron Age. So I'm going to allow that technicality to make this work, because trust me, we do have some crazy scams coming up. The Iron Age is when we truly see the rise of coinage being used. During the mid to late Iron Age, we see coins being minted and being transacted with, which during this time in history, circa 600 BC, is a relatively new methodology of transacting, because up until this point, all of commerce was conducted through trade, one good for another. There was no store of value. It was simply merchandise for merchandise, no currency of any sort, at least in the form of coinage. Prior to coinage, precious metals were definitely the currency of choice, but they weren't necessarily currency, just something of value to most people, and a good way to store value efficiently, as they were non-perishable and value dense for the most part. Now, even during this time in the late Iron Age, these coins that were being made weren't even used for transacting yet. They were primarily religious objects, typically used as badges or medals. But it didn't take too long for these people that were creating these interesting, valuable medals to create something that had trade value. Specifically with ancient Greek coinage being minted by the Ionian Greeks in the late 6th century, right at the ass crack of the Iron Age. And it is believed that these ancient Greek coins were the first coins ever to be used for transacting on a large-scale basis, and they were made primarily of small silver fractions. But this recent innovation of commerce spread like wildfire through the 5th and 6th century BC, and quickly became the standard, primarily being pioneered by the ancient Greeks and other empires of the time. But this in itself isn't the scam, it's simply the context for the scam that we are about to discuss. This context is important because it anchors us to the Iron Age, although what we're about to discuss happens slightly after the Iron Age, and involves actually the Roman Empire. During the Iron Age, ancient Rome is established, and during the end of the Iron Age, the Roman Republic is established. And during these times, the innovation with iron is giving Rome a lot of strength and a lot of military capability. And due to the rise of ancient Rome and then the Roman Republic, we find ourselves with the Roman Empire, which, like I mentioned, isn't in the Iron Age, but we're making it count. And it's with the Roman Empire that we find ourselves with our very next scam. The scam being coin debasement. And this one scam actually ended up being a contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. By the time that the Roman Empire was established, coinage was in full effect and used effectively and worked as follows. Early coinage would be made out of pure or near pure materials, typically gold, silver, and copper. These ingots would be purchased, minted, and then sold into circulation with a face value slightly above their metal value. This allowed the government to make a small profit on every coin that they minted, and also allowed the currency to keep a consistent value, as it had an intrinsic value of the metal it was made out of, while it also had had a face value of only slightly above that, which everyone generally accepted. Coins typically varied in value from region to region, meaning that in simple modern terms, if you had a coin that had a face value of $2, but was, made out of $1.50's worth of silver, in your region, you can trade this for $2. But if you go to a different region where they have their own coinage, they're not going to accept your coinage at face value, but they'll take it at intrinsic value, meaning that your $2 coin in this new region is now worth $1.50. And this system actually incentivized local trade, as you are going to get the most bang for your buck. But the scam we are going to discuss is the debasement of coin that happened when the government wanted to inflate the number of coins that they could produce, and they tried to do so rather sneakily. There was two primary methods of debasement when they started to use this practice. When the government would mint these coins, they would either make them slightly lighter than they were supposed to be, meaning that they would mint a coin and then shave parts off of it to reclaim small scraps, or they would simply use a poor quality metal. This would save them money and make the coins that they're minting cheaper, while they would still be selling them for the same face value, giving the government extra funds. But these methods of debasement continued and began to progress and became more and more severe. What the Roman Empire began to do was start devaluing their coins by not making them a little lighter or using a lower quality material, but actually reducing the percentage of precious metals in the coins. Early coinage of the Roman Empire consisted of anywhere from 93 to 97% of the precious metal they were supposed to be. But it didn't take long for the government to reduce this number from 93% in 107 AD to 78.5% in 193 AD, and then to 35% in 254 AD, and then 20% in 257 AD, and then all the way down until 5% silver in 270 AD. The impact of this was obviously massive, as this massive influx of token supply and massive decline in intrinsic value of these tokens created hyperinflation, and runaway hyperinflation actually happened multiple times throughout the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, most of this debasement would happen to fund military campaigns to try to get more land, more money, more power, and they likely justified this debasement by saying they were going to collect more wealth for the greater empire. Although what really happened was prices would rise, and the value of coins that everybody was collecting, holding, trading with was dropping significantly. And it wasn't unheard of for an army to go on a campaign, get paid their money, only to realize that once they go to spend their money, the big paycheck that they thought they had gotten is now only worth a few days' meals, which obviously put pressure between the government and the army, something that no government wants to have. I think it's important to note that in modern times, the creation of money and steady inflation is something we kind of just accept, and it's part of how our currency operates. However, at this time, each individual coin had an intrinsic value, and that was the backing of its value. And even if you paid for currency in your local region and took it to a different region, even if they did not accept your region's currency, they would still pay you what your precious metal was worth, meaning that your money could never go to nothing. I suppose to put it in a modern day context, imagine if the government just said, hey, actually it's cheaper to make $1 bills than it is to make $5 bills. So all new $1 bills are actually 5. And the government just wrote a 5 on a $1 bill. You can still see that it's a $1 bill, but you and everyone else is supposed to act like it's a $5 bill. That's going to create some suspiciousness. And even that, admittedly, is a bad analogy, because the currency that we use today all has the same intrinsic value of nothing, at least not in its physical form. With early coinage in the Iron Age, there was forgery, debasement, and fraud. But I wanted to cover the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire because I thought it was a great summary of what was brewing in the Iron Age at a major historical scale. And while the Roman Empire did not exist in the Iron Age, ancient Rome did. And I'm making this point abundantly clear to prevent any sort of misinformation. And truthfully, the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire was the best example of coin debasement I could find. So I decided to take a story out of the future and apply it to the Iron Age to make the section the best it could be. So yeah, Rome was formed in the Iron Age, coins were formed in the Iron Age, but likely the most famous example of coin debasement and hyperinflation happened a little after and involved the Roman government literally scamming its people by making the currency cheaper and worse while still maintaining the same face value. And well, it backfired on everybody.
The Classical Era.
Although we are now in the classical era, the scam that we're about to discuss is anything but classy and actually contains what is believed to be the first instance of insurance fraud, which is just great to hear that people have been committing insurance fraud for thousands of years. Perhaps insurance fraud is just in our DNA. In the classical era, there was a man in ancient Greece known as Hegestratos, and he was a little bit of a knucklehead. During roughly 5th century BCE, near the beginning of the classical era, maritime trade was booming. Hegestratos was a ship owner and was profiting from this maritime trade that was taken off. And because he had a big and beautiful and shiny ship, he decided that it would be wise to get insurance, which he did. And this insurance not only covered his cargo, but also his ship on any given sea voyage. How it would work is lenders would lend money to these seafarers using the ship and its loot as collateral. The lender would say, hey, your boat is worth 2 gold ingots and everything in it is worth 5 gold ingots. Great, I'll give you 7 gold ingots. If you come back from your journey of trade with 10 ingots worth of stuff, that's great. Give me 9 ingots. That means I make a 2 ingot profit and you make a 1 ingot profit. But if your ship sinks while you're on this voyage, you don't have to give me anything. That's essentially how the insurance existed, and this helped mitigate the risk for the seafarer and also gave these lenders the opportunity to make money with some risk, but obviously nobody was going to be incentivized to sink their own ship or not come back with loot. The whole point of the voyage was to make money, right? That's where Hegestratos comes in. Hegestratos realized that he didn't actually need to go on any adventures at all, and he didn't even need to fill up his boat with loot. What Hegestratos ended up deciding to do was he would fill his ship with things that looked valuable, and what he would typically do was fill crates with sand, cheap ornaments, with sometimes boxes of valuables on top, to make it appear that the whole ship was full of valuables, when in reality there was a layer of valuables on top of a lot of boxes of basically garbage. This would make the ship appear heavy and full, and also give creditors a good reason to give him a good insurance policy. Already, Hegestratos was scamming, because creditors would give Hegestratos an inflated value, essentially. If Hegestratos was able to convince creditors that his boat was worth at least 2 gold ingots, and the contents of his boat were extremely expensive dyes and spices and metals, maybe they would say that the contents of his boat were worth 10 gold ingots, when in reality it was only worth 2 gold ingots when the rest was dirt and sand. That is obviously a scam. But now, sure, Hegestratos has a bunch of gold ingots, but he also has debt, and he's not going to go sail away and make money off of dirt. So what does he do instead? Well, he would go take this boat and deliberately sink it. Now, all of the money that the creditor had given him was his money, fair and straight, and he really was out nothing, and he could continue this plan over and over. And it wasn't long before Hegestratos' scam was exposed. And this kind of shocked the ancient Greek world, because during this time, there was integrity and respect for the law and understanding when it came to commerce. And such a fraud was not even necessarily thought of. But when this scam was exposed, it kind of exposed the vulnerability in these early financial contracts and how people could manipulate things in a way that may seem counterintuitive, but would ultimately be beneficial for the scammer. The case of Hegestratos is considered to be one of the biggest scams of the classical era. Not only because it was just so ballsy, but also because it was the first instance of insurance scam and kind of gave the entire insurance industry a huge shakeup and a wake-up call for how they had to protect themselves moving forward when they were crediting people who could potentially screw them over. So yeah, the classical era, I'm sure, had more scams than you could count, but I definitely think the case of Hegestratos is one of the most interesting and definitely one of the most defining of this time period.
The medieval era.
I don't know about you, but I feel like the medieval era is definitely one of the most interesting parts of history. You have castles, knights, kingdoms, wealth inequality, and a plethora of scams. What is there not to enjoy? It was honestly a bit tough to pick just one scam for the medieval era, but I'm happy with the one I chose, so let's get right into it. There's no doubt that in medieval times, the Christian religion was everything. And this is kind of proven by all of the art, architecture, writings, everything was the Christian religion. And with every fan base comes collectors. And while the Christian religion didn't necessarily have marketable plushies at the time, they definitely had a huge underground market for relics. And these relics were definitely odd, to say the least. Potentially the most famous Christian relic would be the Holy Grail, but it's definitely not the only relic that people were interested in getting their hands on, with some of the most popular and sought after ancient relics being the literal bones of saints. Like, let's say there was a famous saint who was very prolific and known in the church. Well, once they die, if you could get one of their bones, you could possess their magical powers. Like, literally, that was the mindset. Merchants and other saints and even individuals wanted these bones for a plethora of different reasons. Wealthy individuals would typically want to collect these relics to help make their own desires and dreams come true, as these Christian relics were believed to essentially cause miracles. And in that instance, if there was an object that could bless you, that could make all of your dreams come true, that could protect your family and defeat your enemies, is there really a price you wouldn't pay for them? But here's the thing. Not many people had this money at all. And what people resorted to was visiting churches that had these relics so that they could gain the power and benefit of them from a fraction of the price. And that's exactly why bishops and priests would collect these relics. Obviously, they would see the value of these blessed items that could provide miracles as something that they would want to have in their life and in their church, but they also noticed that any church with a relic was gaining more foot traffic, more donations, and became more or less of a landmark and a hotspot for pilgrimages. And this is where the business opportunity arose. Merchants, whether they believed in the power of these relics or not, if a merchant was able to get their hands on a relic at a decent price, they could sell it to almost anybody with money for an astonishing profit. Here's the issue. As the popularity and demand grew for relics, the supply didn't really. Which was great for investors because, supply and demand, but that also gave incentive for others. The only way that a relic could really even be brought into this underground market was by a crusader who would go and reclaim the relic from the Holy Land, or a merchant who would do business in the Holy Land, hopefully trying to get a relic or something close to a relic that they could buy cheap and sell for a massive profit back in Europe. But these two methods were slow and could not keep up with demand whatsoever, which is why some interesting individuals decided to help contribute to that supply chain issue. Here's the deal. Obviously, these relics have absolutely no certificate of authenticity or receipt or any sort of tracking on where they came from. It's essentially just word of mouth. So if you were a respected or authoritative or even just a charismatic figure, you could kind of pass off anything as a relic with enough convincing. And that's exactly the scam that we are going to discuss. Fake black market Christian relics. Some famous examples of this would be fake bones. For example, St. John the Baptist was a famous saint that people claimed to have relics of, and these relics were his bones. But once all of the bones that were claimed to be his were accounted for and organized, it was concluded that either St. John had 3 heads and 5 arms, or some people had some fake relics. 2 other famous and common fake relics were pieces of the Holy Shroud and splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Obviously, any part of either of these items would have extreme significance to history, and even the tiniest morsel of either of these items would be massively valuable. And for that reason, people decided to make their own. At the time, the only way that these relics could be verified is if they actually had provable miracle abilities. So if a church had a relic in it and somebody with a disability was healed, or a sick person was made healthy again, or a dying person was living longer, or a poor man came into money, if any of these happened after somebody encountered the relic would have been proved real. And the people who had experienced miracles from these relics would go and tell their friends and their family, essentially marketing the church that had this relic in-house. But even with that being said, who's to say if these people had experienced miracles from genuine or non-genuine items? It really kind of gets messy from there. Once the industry of fake relics began to become exposed, it was almost a running joke at the time that if they bought all of the splinters being sold from the cross, they would actually be able to build a warship out of all of the wood. If anybody tries to sell you a piece of wood telling you that it came from the cross that Jesus was crucified on, I would probably pass, or at least confirm it can do miracles before you buy it.
The Renaissance era.
If you've watched any of my time period videos, you would know that I've actually never covered the Renaissance era by itself, mostly because the time period itself is short and kind of similar to the era that took place before it. One of the most famous figures to come out of the Renaissance era was Michelangelo, likely most famous for his statue of David. But did you know that he got his start by scamming? Circa 1496, Michelangelo sculpted a marble sleeping Cupid. It was an extremely lifelike and beautiful sculpture that highlighted exactly how talented Michelangelo was even at an early age. But during the Renaissance era, art collectors weren't necessarily looking for modern art. They were looking for historic pieces, which typically meant ancient Roman or Greek statues, rather than new ones. So what Michelangelo did with this statue of the Cupid was he decided, instead of selling it for a cheaper price compared to the antiques, he decided to make his new statue an antique by intentionally wearing it down. It's not quite confirmed how he did it, but he made sure to make this sculpture look worn. And it obviously worked because he was actually able to sell it as a lost Roman antiquity. And not only was he able to sell it, but he sold it for a much higher price than he was initially looking for. The sculpture was actually sold to a cardinal, Raphael Riario, who initially was fooled, but eventually discovered the truth. When Cardinal Raphael discovered the truth and confronted Michelangelo, he wasn't upset with him, he was actually impressed, and he invited Michelangelo to Rome. And when Michelangelo came to Rome, he was given his first first major opportunity in his career, and this was the actual opportunity that launched Michelangelo's career and made him the icon that he is today. This cardinal was able to understand the genius of the young Michelangelo and was likely thinking that if he could point him in the right direction, he could create one of the best artists of all time. So yeah, as far as Renaissance scams are concerned, I think Michelangelo selling one of his original artworks as an antiquity summarizes this era perfectly. And it's kind of ironic to think that Michelangelo literally had to make his art something else to try and sell it. Regardless, Michelangelo was dope. But when he was starting out, he was definitely clever when it came to selling his art.
The early modern era.
We've covered a lot of scams in this video so far, but one scam we haven't covered is the fake king scam. Obviously, because you can't fake being a king, right? There's no way you can just tell people that, hey, actually, I'm the king. Not only are people not going to believe you, but you're likely going to be killed. And that's the truth unless your name was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s not only claimed to be a king, but also became a serious threat for the reigning king at the time. And he gained significant backing and support. But before we get to how this entire scam ends, let me tell you how it starts. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the two princes in the tower, which, if you're unfamiliar, the princes in the tower refers to a mysterious disappearance of two young royals. King Edward V of England and his younger brother, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were both heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England, but at the ages of 12 and 9, they were locked away in the Tower of London by their uncle, and they were never seen again. This obviously caused a lot of issues within the kingdom, but for Perkin Warbeck, this created an opportunity. Before pretending to be a king, Warbeck was born into a rich merchant-class family and traveled around and spent time in Ireland selling silks before him and his friend came up with the plan to impersonate the younger of the two brothers who disappeared. As this missing person was not only not found, but was an heir to a throne, meaning that if this person was found, they had legitimate claim to the kingdom, which is definitely a title worth fighting for. Warbeck didn't just necessarily hit the streets telling everybody, hey, by the way, I'm the prince and I'm back and I'm totally good. He was very strategic in who he decided to lay his claim to, which was high-ranking government officials. He gained his first piece of notable support from King Charles VIII of France. And this is a major piece of backing to have behind you. Because if the king of another country recognizes and supports you as the lost heir to a throne, you have some serious credibility to your claim. But this didn't last long. As King Henry VII, the current king, had formed an alliance with the King of France, there was no longer support from the King of France to be helping Perkin Warbeck. So we kind of had to start from scratch once again. So the next place that Perkin Warbeck went for support is actually insane, because he went to the actual sister of the lost princes in the tower, and not only did he go there to claim that he was her long-lost brother, but she bought it up. She was like, oh yeah, you are totally my long-lost brother. And now this support was likely even more valuable than the initial support, because no sibling is going to accept a faker as their long-lost sibling, right? Regardless of their beliefs or intentions, this duchess appeared to believe Perkin Warbeck, and with this support, Perkin continued his conquest to claim that he was the long-lost king. The following year, in 1493, he attended the funeral of Maximilian's father, Frederick III, where he was actually recognized as King Richard IV of England at the funeral. And it only took 2 more years in 1495 for support for Warbeck to have the throne bubbling within England. Warbeck was actually able to gather an army of 150 people and attempted a landing in Kent, where Warbeck and his small army were met with locals who were loyal to their actual king, Henry VII, and the Battle of Deal ensued. Most of this army died, and Warbeck retreated back to Ireland. But even in Ireland, he was facing issues and once again fled to Scotland. While in Scotland, Perkin was actually able to set up an arranged marriage with one of the relatives of the king, known as Lady Catherine Gordon. And now, after officially becoming royalty in some regard, the Scottish palace was open to Warbeck to gather his army and begin to plan another attack on England. The attack that Perkin Warbeck and the Scottish king had planned ended up failing before it even started. And what I mean by that is, before the battle even started, they essentially retreated. But the following year, the Scottish king and Warbeck tried again, but this time their landing was different. In 1497, support for the current king of England was low, primarily to new taxes and rising legislation. And for this reason, and because more time had passed for people to sympathize with Perkin, who was pretending to be the lost king, there was slightly more popularity for him on English soil. So this landing was met with some support. He actually was able to raise a rebellion and was declared King Richard IV, the person he was claiming to be this entire time. And at this point, it may have seemed that his plan was successful, and his next plan of attack was to siege the city, where King Henry VII was currently residing, and this siege failed. And once again, his men died, and Perkin Warbeck had to go into hiding once again. And he was able to flee successfully. Well, at least successfully because he escaped the battle alive, but not fully successfully, because the place that he ended up residing applied a lot of pressure to Perkin. So much pressure so that he actually ended up surrendering himself to the English government because he was promised a pardon if he surrendered instead of causing any more battles. In 1497, while being tried in front of the real king himself, Perkin Warbeck finally came clean about his elaborate scam and fake life. He told the king that he was not the prince in the tower and he was not royalty whatsoever. He straight up admitted to being a pretender because he was promised immunity for telling the truth. But obviously that wasn't the case. After this admission, he was kept close to the king and essentially imprisoned. And a year later, he actually tried to escape England, where he was caught and brought back, and at that point he was put ironically in the Tower of London, where the initial two lost princes were lost from. And it was in here where Perkin Warbeck tried to plan another escape and another overthrowing of the government essentially. That plan was uncovered and Perkin Warbeck was executed in 1499. This was a bit of a longer segment, but I wanted to go into detail because this story is literally insane. In a 9-year span, Perkin Warbeck is going from a rich kid who's just living in Ireland selling silk to, from the suggestion of a friend, dedicating the next 9 years of his life essentially on a conquest to claim that he is the long-lost heir to the throne and trying to overthrow the English king, in which he almost does successfully and ends up admitting everything and then dying because of it. If that's not a scam, I don't know what is.
The craziest revenge stories in human history. The year is 1860, and it was a crisp October evening in Hartford, Connecticut. A young, loving couple sat beside their fire in their relatively modest shack, anxiously awaiting the delivery of their new baby boy. And while these soon-to-be parents would be overjoyed to have a baby that is nothing more than happy, healthy, and ordinary, little did they know the son that they were just about to have would not only be extraordinary, but would literally become something of legend. And after hours of torturous labor, this legend was born, with the official birthday of October 26, 1860, and the legal name of Frank Boardman Eaton, although it was the alias he was given later in life that would become his globally recognized name. Frank was a normal and happy child. He enjoyed playing with his friends, he enjoyed time outside, and he particularly enjoyed spending quality time with his father, at least as much as he could get. At the age of 8, Frank and his family moved from Hartford, Connecticut down to Twin Mound, Kansas. And this move, unfortunately, was a turning point in Frank's life. Shortly after Frank and his family moved to Kansas, it was obvious they did not fit in. Frank's father was an abolitionist, although the city they moved to had a pretty strong Confederate population. And during this time, those two did not get along at all. Now, while Frank was initially upset about the move, he quickly made new friends in Kansas, and it almost seemed like his new home. Although, for Frank's parents, it was somewhat obvious that trouble was brewing. Although, they kept their fears away from Frank. That was until they couldn't anymore. Not even 1 year after moving to Kansas, Frank's father was shot dead in cold blood by 6 former Confederate soldiers. These former soldiers were part of a vigilante Southerners group who called themselves the Regulators, and they believed it was totally acceptable to use violence on your political enemies. The news of his father passing devastated both Frank and his mother. Frank's mother was concerned about how she would make ends meet and how she would take care of her boy on her own. And Frank had no idea what life would be like without his best friend. After the murder, many members of the community went to visit their new neighbors and pay their condolences. But it was one man who visited the family that left a particular impact on Frank. This man was named Moses Beeman. He was a friend of Frank's father, and he had one important message for Frank. During his visit, he took Frank in a separate room, sat him down, looked him dead in the eye, and told him the following. "My boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." He said nothing else to the 8-year-old child. He hugged his mother, and he left the house, leaving Frank with a heavy heart and a confused mind. The following week, Moses returned, although he didn't have an order. This time, he had an objective. He took Frank into the backyard, set up some cans on a fence post, and pulled out a gun. At this point, Frank had seen guns but was not familiar, and was more or less traumatized by the thought of handling a gun, due to how his late father died. Although Moses ensured it was okay and safe, and the two began to shoot. And from the age of 8 to 15, Frank, both with Moses and by himself, took shooting very seriously, and very quickly gained expert levels of marksmanship, with no formal training. At the age of 15, Frank decided that it was time to get formal training. He, although being young in modern standards, felt like a man at the time. He had been taking care of his mother for years now, and he felt like the time was right. Frank set out to visit Fort Gibson in Oklahoma.
Although when Frank arrived at the fort, he was quickly turned away, being told he was too young to join the army. Feeling like it was too late to turn back, Frank felt desperate. And it was at that moment that he looked the colonel dead in the eyes and told him, "I know I can't join the army yet, but I just need to learn how to shoot. Please, even for a day, take me in. For all you know, I might even be a better shot than some of your soldiers." And while the colonel saw this as disrespect, he also saw this as a challenge. And he took Frank in to humble him. During his time in the fort, Frank reportedly outshot everybody in the fort and even kept up with the top marksmen in the army. Frank stayed for much longer than he anticipated and participated in many shooting competitions at the fort. So many, in fact, that the commanding officer and that same colonel, John J. Coppener, gave Frank a marksmanship badge and also gave him the now legendary nickname of Pistol Pete. After spending years practicing at home and now having the affirmation of the government for being an extremely skilled marksman, Frank felt emboldened to act on the mission he was given as an 8-year-old boy. Remembering what Moses told him in the hours Moses spent with him, he knew what he had to do. And over the next decade, Frank hunted down and killed every single one of his father's murderers, except for one, who unfortunately passed away before Frank could get to him. After seemingly accomplishing his mission, Frank felt proud and once again lost, and he ended up settling in Oklahoma and decided to use his skills for good and became a sheriff and later a blacksmith. And he also went on to become married, have 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and even live long enough to see 3 of his great-great-grandchildren. Frank, or Pistol Pete, passed away on April 8th, 1958, at the ripe age of 97. And while he has been gone for decades now, his story is definitely still around. And in my opinion, it's one of the coolest revenge stories of human history. But we're also just getting started. I don't know, I really wanted to start the story with Pistol Pete because I thought the story was so cool. You know, almost like a Batman vibe. Like, he was literally given the task as an 8-year-old boy, hey, you have to kill everybody who killed your father or you will be cursed. Like, that's a crazy thing to say to an 8-year-old, but he did it. He took it seriously, he learned marksmanship, he avenged his father, and then used his skills for good. But on top of just being a legend for that, Frank was also a legend for being very personable. And he was so personable and outgoing, in fact, that him riding a horse at a parade in 1923 is the reason why Oklahoma State University has the mascot of Pistol Pete. Students of what would later become Oklahoma State University literally saw Frank on a horse, being Frank and just doing outrageous things and being outgoing, and decided that this guy is the perfect representation of our school. And for that reason, they petitioned to change the mascot, and well, the rest is history. Because it wouldn't be until 1958 that a caricature of Frank known as Pistol Pete would become the official mascot. And the now iconic logo was not even a licensed symbol until the 1980s, obviously long after Frank passed away. Since Frank's passing, he has won multiple awards. Most notably, in 1997, he was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, and in 2022, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma. And literally only last year, in 2025, he was also inducted into the Oklahoma State University Hall of Fame, further proving that Pistol Pete is a legend. And in Oklahoma, he is very much so appreciated. Frank had a normal upbringing, but because of unfortunate circumstances outside of his control, his father was taken from him and he was given a mission he would go on to fulfill and then live a long, prosperous life. Honestly, that's how you make lemonade out of lemons. But we're only just getting started and we have more stories to get into. The year is 963. Harold Bluetooth, the King of Denmark, and his wife were both awaiting the delivery of their son. Although this time, they weren't in a modest shack. They were in a quite luxurious castle. After hours of grueling labor and beating all odds, the queen survived, and the baby boy was born happy and healthy. And his name was Sweyn Forkbeard. Growing up as the son of the King of Denmark, Sweyn had a much different upbringing than most Danes. Sweyn was born into one of the most iconic bloodlines in all of Viking history, and it was for this reason that he had massive shoes to fill. Fortunately, due to his unique upbringing, he was exposed to knowledge and education that most Danes could never dream of, and it was this experience in his early life that set him up for success as a strong leader. Without having really any recorded facts of the upbringing of Sweyn, there's not much to report about his early life, besides the fact that it is very likely that he was exposed to warfare, strategy, and swordsmanship at a very young age, and this was proven later in life. As Sweyn began to develop from a young boy to a young man, he began to have more and more tension with his father, or at least his father figure, because it is believed that Harold Bluetooth is likely not the biological father of Sweyn, but more likely the stepfather, with the biological father being Harold's brother who passed away before Sweyn was ever born, marrying his brother's widow and taking on the child as his own. That, on a surface level, seems admirable. Although, as we will go on to learn, this decision was likely his downfall. As Sweyn grew from a young boy to a young man, he felt he was ready to take on responsibility. And Sweyn approached his father, asking him for a piece of Denmark, something that he could own and rule and practice his kingsmanship in. Although Bluetooth denied the request, and Sweyn took this rejection as an act of war. Sweyn quickly decided that he only had one option if he truly wanted to gain power, and that was to take it. And shortly after this denial, he began gathering an army, telling Bluetooth that he was going to go on a raid at some point. However, in reality, the swords he was collecting were going to be pointed at his father. Now, the reason why Sweyn went to such extreme lengths to betray his father are debated, although it's not believed that he tried to overthrow his father simply just because he was denied land. It is believed that it was the combination of this land denial on top of another factor that caused, well, such a violent overthrowing, which we will discuss. Those two additional factors that are debated, well, are the following. Some believe that it was around this time where Sweyn found out that Bluetooth was not his true biological father, therefore emboldening him to overthrow Bluetooth because he was the true heir to the throne, not Bluetooth. And the other belief is that Sweyn simply did not like the Christianization of Denmark, and that's because Bluetooth was the first king of Denmark to be baptized and accept Christianity as the primary religion, something that rubbed Sweyn the wrong way, because he held the pagan Viking traditions and beliefs closely to his heart, and his Christianization seemed like a betrayal. Unfortunately, we may never know what the true reasons were. Regardless, a large-scale battle took place. Bluetooth's army actually won the battle. However, Bluetooth sustained a massive injury during the battle and died shortly after. And because of this, Sweyn was now made the king of Denmark, supposedly at the age of 23. During Sweyn's time as the king of Denmark, he was involved in multiple large-scale historic battles, each of which are worthy of a video on their own. But to summarize the next few decades, Sweyn used his might and strategy to take over significant parts of Norway, so much to the fact that he actually became the king of Norway as well in the year 1999, and then set his sights on England. However, the English were not so happy to have the Danes on their land. And it was because of the English's disdain for the Danes in England that the King of England at the time, King Ethelred the Unready, ordered the massacre and mass murder of all of the Danes in England. This event was known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, and it took place in November of 1002. This massacre was undoubtedly tragic for the Danes in England and their families back home, and one of the most notable individuals impacted by this massacre was Sweyn Forkbeard, because both his brother and sister were murdered in this massacre. And it was these exact murders that gave Sweyn the motivation and justification to let all hell break loose on England. And that he did. Sweyn was already occupying parts of England because of the prospect of revenue. Although now with this newfound justification, they wanted not just parts of England, they wanted to rule the entire country. And from the year 1002 to the year 1012, Sweyn engaged in 3 different full-scale battles on England. And by the end of the following year, 1013, Sweyn became the official king of England by means of conquest, making him the king of a 3rd consecutive country, the king of Denmark, the king of Norway, and now the king of England. And with the conquest of this final country, he was able to enact his revenge. Because although the king of England took a brother and a sister from Sweyn Forkbeard, Sweyn took the crown and the country from the king of England, something he likely planned on doing anyway. Although with this added motivation, I'm sure it made the revenge that much sweeter. The full detailed story of Sweyn Forkbeard is obviously something I can't go into in this video. Although I'm really hoping this brief summary gave a pretty good overlook on how one man could lose some siblings but gain a country. Now, I'm definitely not going to say Sweyn seemed like an innocent, harmless individual. He was a ruthless ruler, and it appears he partook and engaged in some of the very much so common brutality of his day. Although, when a king decides it's acceptable to exterminate an entire group of people, there needs to be pushback. Unfortunately, the King of England just happened to mess with the wrong Viking. Now, I would be lying if I didn't tell the full story, because shortly after taking the crown in England, Sweyn did die. And he died, unfortunately, only 40 days after becoming the King of England, giving him only limited time to enjoy everything he had worked for. It's like they say, is it better to have loved and lost, or never loved at all? In my opinion, the story of Sweyn Forkbeard is so interesting. And the fact that he was the king of 3 countries at once, to me, is mind-blowing. And sure, the guy, overthrew his dad, or stepdad, we don't really know. But when somebody kills your brother and sister, either in law or by blood, taking that individual's crown and country in retaliation seems like pretty sweet revenge.
And yet, there's still more to discuss. The year is 1783. Two new American immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy in Pennsylvania. And I don't know why baby boy is such a cliche in this video. I did not intend this. Regardless, two Irish-Scottish immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy. His name was Hugh, and he was about to become, once again, a legend. Hugh's early life is not necessarily well known, although he is extremely famous for what happened near the end of his life. In his early life, Hugh set out to become an explorer, and on one of his expeditions, he was actually essentially enslaved by pirates when his ship was overtaken by pirates, and he was given the ultimatum of either dying or becoming a pirate and fighting with them. He chose life and unfortunately spent multiple years as a pirate doing pirate things. On one of his missions, Hugh decided to ditch his pirate crew and spend time with some of the Native Americans that he had met in Texas. Now, he wasn't intentionally trying to be in Texas, the pirates were simply here, and he decided to just jump ship. Interestingly, the Native Americans that he had met were not fans of pirates whatsoever, and for this reason, he was sentenced to death almost immediately when meeting these natives. It has been reported that right before his execution by the natives, Hugh was able to offer these natives an expensive dye that they could use to dye garments and for war paints, and this was enough to spare his life. And because of this transaction, he was able to not only live, but spend the next couple of years living amongst this tribe, a time when he was able to hone in his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman. After Hugh spent multiple years as a pirate and then multiple years as a tribesman, Hugh decided it was time for something new. And it was at this time that he left the group of natives he was living with and decided to travel to St. Louis, Missouri in 1821. At this point, Hugh had been on this earth for nearly 40 years and had lived a full life for many up until this point. Although it was this move that he made to St. Louis that would truly cement Hugh Glass as a legend, at least in terms of revenge stories. The following year, after moving to St. Louis, Missouri, Hugh noticed an advertisement in the newspaper, the Missouri Gazette. The advertisement was commissioned by William Henry Ashley, and the advertisement was calling for 100 men to ascend the river Missouri as part of a fur trading venture. And to Hugh, somebody who's lived a rather storied life up until this point, this career opportunity not only sounded exciting, but also seemed like something that was directly within his skill set. And so he decided to respond to the advertisement and get the job. Him and 99 other men, of course. The group of men that ended up getting hired for this position became known as Ashley's 100, which, if you ask me, kind of sounds like another crazy OnlyFans challenge, but we'll put that to the side. These Ashley's 100 were some of the most rugged and skilled mountain men that Missouri had to offer. And once the group was fully organized, the following year, they had started their expedition. An expedition that would be longer and harder than Glass could ever imagine. The expedition was almost instantly met with resistance from Native Americans. It was reported that the Americans tried to initiate trade, but were met with violence, which resulted in an all-out war against this native settlement and, well, these traveling traders. The result of this conflict was the entire village being burned down, everyone dying on the native side, and a vast majority of the Ashley 100 dying as well. Following this all-out war on the tribe, Hugh and 13 other men continued their journey to the Yellowstone River, where they intended to trap and fur beavers. To me, that fact alone is crazy that they literally had a full-scale war during this expedition and they, just continued to get beaver pelts of all things. Regardless, it wouldn't be this all-out war with the native tribes that would be the source of revenge. That betrayal and revenge would actually come from within the Ashley 100. Once Hugh and the 13 other men finally arrived in Yellowstone, the men split up and began looking for furs. And that was when Hugh stumbled upon an ominously quiet clearing right outside of a small creek. And this area, unfortunately, turned out to be a bear's nest and resulted in Hugh Glass being mauled by a bear severely. This angry, aggressive mother bear threw him to the ground and then pinned him down as she bit into Hugh, threw chunks of his meat to her cubs, and then her cubs also began to attack Hugh as well. To call this bear attack brutal is an understatement, and by the time that his fellow hunters and trappers were able to kill the bears, Hugh was essentially a shell of a man and wasn't even believed to be alive. Although, shockingly, upon further inspection, Hugh was breathing and somehow still alive. Although, just because he was alive now didn't mean he would be alive for long. And because of this, the other men put Hugh on a stretcher and began carrying him, assuming that they would carry him for the day, set up camp, sleep, and in the morning he would be dead and they could bury him. Although, after a day of carrying him, and then after sleeping through the night and finding him still alive, the group decided that it didn't make sense to carry him all the way home because he obviously wouldn't survive.
and the group decided to move on, but they did leave 2 people to watch over Hugh's body so that they could give him a proper burial once he did pass away. These 2 men, Fitzgerald, an older man, and Bridger, a younger boy, only a teen, both watched over Hugh for 5 consecutive days. And shockingly, Hugh survived every single one of those days. Although to his team members, this was not a miracle. This was a liability, because these men were still in the middle of the wilderness, and they knew that they had bears and also angry native tribes on their tail. And these men were growing more anxious by the day. And it was on that 5th day that these men decided that they had to abandon Hugh. And that they did. They took his gun and everything of value off his person besides his clothes and left him to die by a creek. However, Hugh didn't die. And what he did next made him the legend that we likely are all familiar with today. And if you've seen the movie The Revenant, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Following being abandoned, Hugh surprisingly was able to come to and regained some form of consciousness, although his body was simply not cooperating. He had multiple broken ribs, a broken arm, a broken leg, and was truly in horrendous shape. However, he did have enough strength to drink water out of the stream, eat berries off of bushes, and gather enough nutrition to sustain himself. And with berries in his belly, he came to terms with the fact that he had been abandoned by his team. And with this realization, he became enraged. So enraged, in fact, that he decided that he would make it back to his camp and confront those men that abandoned him at any cost. And with that, he began the multiple 100-mile trek, starting with just crawling and eventually being able to hobble and walk the entirety of the way. After somehow surviving and maneuvering over 240 miles, Hugh reached a fur trading outpost where he was able to hitch a boat ride back to his original camp. And this was fortunate because this boat ride alone was an additional 300 miles, something that he likely would not have survived on foot. Regardless, after this boat ride, Hugh and the French fur traders he was with were attacked by another Native American tribe, although they were also defended by a separate Native American tribe. And the result of this all-out conflict was the death of everybody in Hugh's camp except for himself. And these Native Americans that saved his life and fought on his behalf, once again, delivered him directly to a separate trading post where he was offered the opportunity to rest, but he did not take it because he had not yet achieved his goal of getting his revenge. Now, mind you, this was 6 months after the bear attack at this point. Everybody who had ever known Hugh would have likely believed he was dead. Although little did they know, Hugh was very much so alive. And the 2 men that abandoned him were about to get an earful, to say the least. Shortly after this encounter, Hugh finally made it to Fort Henry, the fort where his original company was supposed to be. And it was there where Hugh ran into Bridger, one of the 2 men that abandoned him. Although Bridger was not a man, he was a boy. And after Hugh talked to Bridger, he came to the conclusion that Bridger was a bystander. He was simply only following orders and did not intentionally betray Hugh. And because of this, after a harsh winter, Hugh decided to once again continue his journey to find Fitzgerald. He joined another mission to go 400 miles upstream to a new trading post where Fitzgerald was supposed to be, and he was well on his way to get his revenge. Although once this boat had landed, it was once again attacked by another group of Native Americans. Most of his group died, and Hugh was once again left, I'm not even joking, to his own devices, where he was injured, alone, and had to walk hundreds of miles. After nearly a year of pain, torture, suffering, and, well, anger, Hugh was finally able to run into Fitzgerald at a settlement known as Fort Atkinson. However, at this fort, it was revealed that Fitzgerald had joined the United States Army. And if Hugh wanted to get revenge on Fitzgerald, it would be a death sentence, because killing a soldier was a crime punishable by execution. Although, I don't think Hugh needed to kill Fitzgerald to get his point across, because I'm sure for Fitzgerald, even seeing Hugh would have been shocking. But beyond just making his presence and, well, being alive known to Fitzgerald, Hugh also told Fitzgerald that while he can't kill him now, if he ever leaves the army, he will personally kill Fitzgerald. And while to some that may not sound like the most satisfying revenge, being able to come face to face to the man who abandoned you and not kill him, but to tell him, hey, I'm alive, I survived everything, and I'm not going to kill you. A, because I can't, but B, because you might have worse things coming to you. And while death is a harsh punishment, war is no walk in the park. And I would personally like to believe that being able to overcome and survive everything that Hugh did, coming face to face with the person that abandoned him and telling him off, and being the bigger man was likely the most satisfying thing he could have done in that situation. But for all I know, he could also have just been extremely mad that he was a soldier and was avidly waiting for him to, not be a soldier anymore so he could get his real revenge. But I'll leave that for you guys to decide in the comments. Regardless, hopefully this extremely oversimplified version of the story of Hugh Glass paints just a small picture of how much of a badass he truly was. And if you want to learn more about it, watch the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Or if you want a more accurate depiction, read some historical documents. This guy went to hell and back multiple times and could never truly catch a break. Although he was able to survive seemingly the impossible, and he was able to come face to face with the man who left him for dead and tell him that he survived the impossible and that it was Fitzgerald's turn to survive war.